Welcome, wanderer of shadows, to the complete chronicle of darkness that dwells within the Four Nations. Tonight, we explore not the tales of heroism and triumph, but the blood-stained pages history prefers to forget. This is a journey through genocide and betrayal, through the moral compromises that even the greatest heroes must make, and through the endless cycle of violence that no avatar has ever truly broken. The world of the Four Nations is beautiful, but beneath its surface lies an ocean of suffering that spans centuries. So settle into the darkness and let us traverse the shadows together. The dawn that broke over the air temples on the day of Sozin's comet was no different from countless others that had blessed the mountains where the air nomads had lived in harmony for over 9 centuries. Prayer flags still danced in the morning breeze, their colors bright against stone that had weathered generations of peaceful contemplation. The wind chimes sang their ancient melodies while lemurs chattered in gardens where vegetables grew according to principles that honored all living things. But this would be the last dawn that would ever rise over a world that included the air nomads as living, breathing participants in the great dance of existence. Firelord Sozin's plan for what his propagandists would later call the Air Nomad solution had been refined through months of careful preparation that demonstrated the systematic thinking that separated organized genocide from mere warfare. This was not conquest driven by territorial ambition or the heat of battle, but the methodical elimination of an entire people whose very existence contradicted the Fire Nation's vision of how the world should be ordered. The Air Nomads' commitment to peace, their rejection of national boundaries, their spiritual practices that emphasized compassion over strength, made them more than political opponents to be defeated. They were philosophical enemies whose continued existence would always provide alternative models for human society that Fire Nation ideology could not tolerate. The intelligence that guided this campaign had been gathered over decades through merchants and diplomats who had visited the air temples under the pretense of cultural exchange and trade negotiations. Every detail of air nomad society had been catalogued with the thoroughness that would later be applied to the systematic destruction of that society. The locations of sacred texts, the schedules of communal gatherings, the defensive capabilities of temple architecture, the movement patterns of sky bison herds, the agricultural cycles that determined when populations would be concentrated in specific locations, had all been documented with bureaucratic precision that transformed mass murder into administrative procedure. The comet that blazed across the sky as Fire Nation forces approached their targets was treated by Sozin's soldiers as divine endorsement of their mission, cosmic approval for actions that would otherwise have challenged the moral frameworks that had guided Fire Nation culture for centuries. The enhanced firebending that the celestial visitor provided was interpreted as evidence that their cause was righteous, that the universe itself supported their efforts to purify the world of elements that prevented true harmony from being achieved. The irony that they were committing genocide in the name of peace was lost on warriors whose education had prepared them to see air nomad pacifism as weakness rather than strength, spiritual discipline as cowardice rather than courage. The attack on the Southern Air Temple began before sunrise, when the community was gathered for morning meditation in the temple's central courtyard. The air nomads, who had risen early to greet the dawn with gratitude and spiritual reflection, found themselves trapped in the very space where they had always felt most safe and connected to the divine forces that guided their understanding of existence. The firebenders who surrounded them moved with military precision that had been rehearsed through countless drills designed to overcome any resistance that air nomad defensive capabilities might provide. Though their intelligence had correctly predicted that such resistance would be minimal and largely symbolic, Monk Gyatso's presence among the doomed provided the only significant opposition that the Fire Nation forces encountered during their systematic work of elimination. The old airbending master who had raised Aang with such gentle wisdom proved capable of terrible fury when protecting the children and fellow monks who represented everything he valued in existence. His airbending became a weapon of devastating effectiveness as he channeled decades of spiritual discipline into combat techniques that no Fire Nation strategist had anticipated or prepared to counter through conventional military responses. The room where Gyatso made his final stand would be discovered a century later by the boy he had loved as a son, its contents telling a story of desperate heroism that had ultimately proven insufficient to prevent the tragedy it had tried to forestall. The skeletons that surrounded Gyatso's remains wore Fire Nation armor that testified to the cost his resistance had extracted from the attackers. Proof that even the gentlest souls could become terrible when defending what they held most sacred against forces that recognized no limits to their appetite for destruction and domination. But individual heroism, no matter how fierce or skillfully applied, could not overcome the systematic nature of the campaign that had been designed to eliminate every air nomad settlement simultaneously before word could spread or defensive preparations could be organized. The Eastern Air Temple fell to attacks coordinated with the precision that characterized all Fire Nation military operations. Its libraries burning while their irreplaceable texts fed flames that consumed centuries of accumulated wisdom about spiritual practice and philosophical understanding that had guided Air Nomad society since its earliest foundations. The Western Air Temple's unique architecture, carved into a mountainside, and accessible only through airbending or sky bison flight, provided natural defensive advantages that prolonged resistance for several hours beyond what Fire Nation planners had calculated. The temple's inverted design created tactical challenges that forced attackers to adapt their approaches while defending air. Nomads used their intimate knowledge of the structure's hidden passages and chambers to mount guerrilla operations that inflicted casualties on forces that had expected to complete their mission without significant opposition. The children who hid in the temple's deepest chambers listened to the sounds of battle growing closer as defensive lines collapsed under sustained assault by enemies whose enhanced abilities made traditional air nomad evasion technique inadequate for survival. The youngest among them had never seen violence before this day, their education having focused on harmony and cooperation rather than conflict and resistance. Their final moments were spent in terror and confusion that no amount of spiritual preparation could have made comprehensible or bearable. The Northern Air Temple, largest and most populous of the 4 sacred sites, represented the greatest challenge to Fire Nation forces and the most significant victory when its defenses finally crumbled before sustained bombardment that reduced ancient stone to rubble and ash. The temple's extensive workshops where air nomad artisans had created the gliders and tools that enabled their unique relationship with the element of air were specifically targeted for complete destruction, eliminating not just the people who possessed technical knowledge, but the physical infrastructure that had made their innovations possible. The sky bison that had served as partners and companions to air nomad families for generations became specific targets of extermination efforts that recognized their crucial role in air nomad mobility and cultural identity. These gentle giants who had never shown aggression toward any living creature were hunted with the same systematic thoroughness that characterized every aspect of the genocide, their size and docility, making them easy prey for firebenders, whose enhanced abilities could strike them down, even at flying altitudes that should have provided safety from ground-based attacks. The lemurs that had shared air nomad communities as beloved companions and spiritual guides were slaughtered alongside their human friends, their playful nature making them unable to comprehend or flee from violence that struck without warning or apparent reason. Ring-tailed flying lemurs that had entertained generations of air nomad children with their acrobatic displays fell from burning trees, while their habitats were transformed into crematoriums that consumed every living thing that had once found sanctuary in temple gardens and meditation groves. The systematic destruction of air-nomad agricultural systems ensured that even those who might have initially escaped the direct violence of the assault would find no resources for long-term survival in lands that had been deliberately poisoned against any future habitation. The carefully maintained gardens where air nomads had grown food according to principles that honored plant life even while harvesting its fruits were salted and burned, their soil contaminated with chemicals that would prevent any vegetation from growing for years to come. The libraries that housed air nomad philosophical texts, historical records, and spiritual teachings were subjected to particularly thorough destruction that went beyond mere burning to encompass systematic efforts to ensure that no fragment of written knowledge could survive to inspire future generations who might attempt to reconstruct what had been lost. Fire Nation scholars who accompanied the military forces identified texts of particular significance for complete obliteration, recognizing that ideas could be as dangerous as people when they offered alternatives to imperial ideology. The musical instruments that had provided soundtracks for air nomad celebrations and meditations were smashed and burned with vindictive thoroughness that suggested understanding of their importance to community identity and cultural continuity. The songs that had been passed down through generations died with the voices that had carried them, their melodies lost forever when the last person who remembered their words and rhythms breathed their final breath in temple courtyards that had once echoed with joy and harmonious celebration. The workshops where air nomad craftsmen had created the specialized equipment that enabled their unique way of life were systematically destroyed along with their tools and materials, ensuring that knowledge of airbending applications that had taken centuries to develop would disappear completely. The gliders that had allowed individual air nomads to soar through mountain air with the grace of birds were broken into pieces too small to be repaired or studied, while the techniques for their construction died with the masters who had refined their design through generations of patient experimentation. The spiritual artifacts that had connected air nomad communities to their understanding of the divine were desecrated with particular cruelty that demonstrated Fire Nation recognition of their symbolic importance to the culture being eliminated. Sacred statues were defaced and toppled, their fragments scattered to prevent any future reconstruction of the spiritual focal points that had anchored air nomad religious practices and provided tangible connections to beliefs that transcended material concerns. The meditation chambers where air nomads had practiced the spiritual disciplines that formed the foundation of their entire way of life were converted into mass graves that mocked everything these spaces had once represented. The silence that followed the completion of the Fire Nation's work was not the peaceful quiet of contemplation, but the terrible emptiness that comes when voices that should be speaking have been permanently silenced through violence that respects no boundaries of age, innocence, or spiritual dedication. The propaganda that justified these actions to Fire Nation citizens emphasized the necessity of eliminating threats to world harmony, portraying air nomad pacifism as dangerous weakness that encouraged chaos and prevented the strong leadership that global peace required. The Comet's enhancement of Fire Nation abilities was presented as cosmic validation of their mission, divine empowerment that proved the righteousness of their cause, and the inevitability of their victory over forces that stood in the way of universal prosperity and order. The celebration that followed news of the air nomads' complete elimination was orchestrated with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized the genocide itself, transforming mass murder into patriotic triumph through ceremonies that honored soldiers who had served their nation by committing acts that would have been considered war crimes in any previous era of Fire Nation history. The comet was declared a national symbol of Fire Nation destiny, its periodic return a reminder of the divine favor that had enabled their greatest victory over the forces of disorder and weakness. The children who were born in the years following the genocide grew up in a world where air nomads existed only as historical footnotes in textbooks that described them as obstacles to progress rather than human beings with their own cultures, dreams, and contributions to the richness of human experience. These children learned to see the elimination of an entire people as necessary and proper, their moral education shaped by teachers who had been trained to present genocide as administrative efficiency rather than crime against humanity. The silence that settled over the mountains where air temples had once bustled with life and learning was broken only by wind that carried no human voices, by weather patterns that no longer supported communities whose presence had been part of the natural balance that had sustained these ecosystems for centuries. The lemurs that had survived the initial slaughter gradually died out without human companions to share their environment, their populations declining until the mountains knew only the sounds of storm and season, unmoderated by consciousness, that could appreciate their beauty or find meaning in their cycles. The sky bison that had escaped the systematic extermination faced slow extinction through isolation and the loss of the human partnerships that had been essential to their species' reproductive success and social development. The last wild herds dwindled as they failed to maintain the complex relationships with human communities that had defined their existence since the earliest days of air nomad civilization, their gradual disappearance completing the elimination of a way of life that had once seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves. And so the sun set on the day when the air nomads died, its light painting the sky in shades of red that seemed appropriate for what had been accomplished beneath its passage. The comet that had enabled such comprehensive destruction continued its journey through space, indifferent to how its power had been used, leaving behind a world diminished by the absence of voices that had once spoken for peace, for harmony, for the possibility that strength could be expressed through gentleness rather than conquest. The boy who would eventually discover the extent of this tragedy was sleeping in ice 100 years removed from understanding what his flight from responsibility had failed to prevent, his preservation. A cosmic joke that ensured the last air nomad would return to a world where his people existed only in memory, and stone monuments that marked places where laughter had once echoed through halls, now empty of everything except ghosts and the weight of what could never be recovered or restored. The water that lapped against the shores of Avatar Kuruk's homeland carried whispers of tragedies that no living person could hear, stories of battles fought in realms where physical laws held no meaning and victory could be measured only in the preservation of sanity that grew more fragile with each confrontation. The Northern Water Tribe knew their avatar as a young man blessed with exceptional abilities and cursed with responsibilities that aged his spirit far beyond his years, though none among his people could understand why someone so gifted seemed to carry such profound sadness in eyes that should have reflected the confidence that came with cosmic power. Kuruk's predecessor, Avatar Yangchen, had left behind a world where the balance between human and spirit realms had been maintained through negotiated treaties that favored human interests at the expense of spiritual autonomy and dignity. Her diplomatic solutions had pushed malevolent spirits back into their own realm through agreements that treated symptoms rather than causes, creating temporary peace that stored up cosmic resentment, like pressure building behind a dam that would inevitably burst when the forces containing it could no longer bear the weight of accumulated grievance and supernatural fury. The spirits that had been banished or constrained by Yang Chen's well-intentioned policies had spent the years following her death growing stronger and more bitter, their anger fermenting in spiritual dimensions where time moved according to different principles than those governing mortal existence. What seemed like reasonable compromise to human negotiators was experienced as humiliating defeat by entities whose understanding of justice operated on scales that encompassed centuries and whose capacity for holding grudges extended far beyond the brief spans of human memory and forgiveness. The first signs of spiritual unrest manifested as disturbances that seemed minor to casual observation, but carried implications that terrified those few individuals who understood the deeper mechanics of how spirit and physical worlds influenced each other through connections that remained largely invisible to normal human perception. Crops withered without apparent cause. In regions where soil and weather conditions should have supported abundant harvests, while animals began exhibiting behavioral patterns that suggested exposure to influences that existed outside the natural order that governed material existence. Kuruk's early attempts to address these problems followed conventional avatar approaches that emphasized negotiation and compromise, seeking solutions that would satisfy both human needs and spiritual concerns. Through careful diplomacy, backed by the cosmic authority that came with his unique position as bridge between worlds. But the spirits he encountered in these initial diplomatic efforts were fundamentally different from those that previous avatars had dealt with, their corruption by years of resentment having transformed them into entities that could not be reasoned with or appeased through traditional methods of conflict resolution. The dark spirits that began manifesting in increasing numbers throughout the physical world were not simply angry or misguided beings that could be redirected toward constructive purposes through patient conversation and mutual understanding. They had become something fundamentally hostile to human existence, their original natures perverted by sustained exposure to negative emotions until they could find satisfaction only through causing the kind of suffering they believed humans had inflicted upon their realm through the disrespectful agreements that Yang Chen had negotiated on behalf of her ignorant and ungrateful species. Kuruk's first direct confrontation with one of these corrupted entities occurred during what should have been a routine spiritual consultation, requested by fishing communities, whose catches had mysteriously declined, despite favorable weather and normal seasonal patterns. The spirit that emerged from waters that had suddenly turned black and foul was barely recognizable as something that had once been a guardian of ocean life. Its form twisted into shapes that hurt to observe, while its presence emanated malice so pure and concentrated that several witnesses lost their sanity simply from brief exposure to its unfiltered hatred. The battle that followed was unlike anything recorded in Avatar histories or spiritual texts, requiring techniques that Kuruk had to improvise while fighting an opponent that seemed to grow stronger from his attacks rather than being weakened by them. The Avatar state that he entered to match the spirit's supernatural abilities provided cosmic power, but also opened his consciousness to direct contact with malevolence that left permanent scars on his psyche, damage that would influence every subsequent encounter with the spiritual forces he was supposed to be guiding toward harmony with human civilization. The victory that Kuruk achieved came at costs that were not immediately apparent, but would compound over time, as his spiritual battles continued to expose him to forms of corruption that no human consciousness was designed to process or contain safe. Each defeated dark spirit left behind traces of itself within his awareness, fragments of cosmic evil that contaminated his thoughts and dreams while gradually undermining the moral foundations that had originally motivated his commitment to protecting the innocent from supernatural threats that they could not comprehend or resist through normal means. The isolation that began to characterize Kuruk's existence was both voluntary and inevitable, as he recognized that his increasing exposure to spiritual darkness made him dangerous to the people he was trying to protect, while his growing understanding of the true scope of the threat he faced made normal human concerns seem trivial and irrelevant compared to cosmic stakes that could affect the fundamental nature of reality itself. His friends and advisors found themselves unable to relate to someone whose experiences transcended normal categories of human understanding. While he discovered that explaining his situation to people who had never ventured into spiritual realms was impossible without either lying or driving them to despair. The face stealer that became Kuruk's most persistent and dangerous opponent was among the most ancient and powerful of the spirits that had been driven to open hostility by Yang Chen's policies. Its ability to permanently steal human identities, making it a threat that could not be ignored or contained through diplomatic means that might be applied to lesser supernatural entities. Each face it claimed represented not just individual tragedy, but the complete erasure of someone who had existed, their memories and personalities absorbed into spiritual darkness that used their stolen identities to become increasingly effective at mimicking humanity while harboring intentions that were fundamentally alien to everything that defined human nature and values. Ko's patient stalking of Kuruk's loved ones was psychological warfare designed to inflict maximum suffering on an avatar whose power made direct assault impossible, forcing him to choose between protecting specific individuals and addressing broader threats that endangered entire communities if left unchallenged. The spirit's intelligence and cunning made these attacks particularly devastating because they exploited Kuruk's emotional attachments and moral commitments, using his virtues as weapons against him while gradually isolating him from every relationship that might have provided emotional support during his increasingly desperate campaign against forces of spiritual corruption. The death of Ummi, Kuruk's beloved, represented the culmination of Ko's campaign of personal terrorism and the beginning of Kuruk's descent into the kind of spiritual darkness that he had been fighting to prevent from consuming the human world. Her face was stolen during a moment of perfect happiness, her identity erased while she smiled at the man she loved, creating trauma so profound that Kuruk's rage nearly drove him into the same kind of corruption that characterized his enemies, threatening to transform the Avatar himself into the very evil he had dedicated his life to opposing. The years of warfare in spiritual realms that followed Ummi's death consumed what remained of Kuruk's humanity as he pursued vengeance against entities that could not be permanently destroyed through conventional means, his battles becoming increasingly violent and desperate as he learned to match spiritual corruption with techniques that required him to embrace aspects of darkness that gradually contaminated his own nature. The line between protector and destroyer blurred as his methods grew more extreme, and his willingness to accept collateral damage increased in proportion to his desperation to achieve victories that seemed to matter less with each hard-won success. The friends who had once provided Kuruk with emotional grounding and moral perspective died one by one during his prolonged absence from the physical world, their deaths occurring through natural causes that he was too consumed by spiritual warfare to prevent or even acknowledge until it was too late to say goodbye or express gratitude for relationships that had sustained him during the early years of his Avatar incarnation. Their passing eliminated the last human connections that might have pulled him back from the brink of complete spiritual dissolution into the cosmic forces he had been channeling with increasing recklessness. Jianzhu, Kuruk's earthbending companion, died while Kuruk was fighting spirits in realms that existed outside normal time, his final moments spent wondering why his closest friend had abandoned him to face old age and mortality alone while pursuing battles that seemed to matter more than the relationships that had defined their shared youth and adventures. Together, the guilt that Kuruk felt upon learning of this death was complicated by recognition that his spiritual duties had indeed been more important than personal loyalty, creating internal contradictions that further accelerated his psychological deterioration. Hei Ran, the firebending master who had trained alongside Kuruk, fell to an opponent that the Avatar might have helped her defeat if he had been present in the physical world rather than locked in combat with dark spirits that posed threats to the fundamental structure of reality itself. Her death represented not just personal loss, but practical diminishment of the forces available to resist supernatural corruption, weakening defenses against spiritual invasion, while eliminating someone whose tactical intelligence and combat experience had been crucial to early victories against entities that conventional military forces could not engage. Effectively, Kelsang, the airbending monk whose spiritual discipline had complemented Kuruk's more aggressive approach to supernatural conflict, died in meditation while attempting to understand the philosophical implications of the Avatar's increasingly violent methods of maintaining cosmic balance. His death was peaceful, but represented the loss of moral perspective that might have helped Kuruk maintain connection to the principles that had originally motivated his commitment to protecting humanity from spiritual corruption that threatened to overwhelm all existence. The isolation that characterized Kuruk's final years was both geographical and psychological, as he withdrew from human contact to avoid contaminating others with spiritual darkness that had become part of his essential nature. Through prolonged exposure to cosmic evil that no consciousness could process without being permanently changed. His rare appearances in the physical world frightened people who remembered him as young and vital, his presence now carrying traces of spiritual corruption that made normal humans instinctively avoid him, while his eyes held knowledge of horrors that no mortal was meant to witness or survive. The madness that began to manifest in Kuruk's behavior was not simply psychological breakdown, but spiritual contamination that affected his ability to distinguish between different levels of reality, causing him to respond to spiritual threats that existed only in other dimensions while ignoring physical dangers that posed immediate risks to his deteriorating body and increasingly fragmented sanity. His conversations with invisible entities disturbed witnesses who could not see or hear the supernatural forces that continued to plague him even during his brief returns to the mortal world. The drinking that consumed Kuruk's final years represented his attempt to numb awareness that had been expanded beyond human limits through exposure to cosmic truths that mortal consciousness could not integrate without losing essential humanity. Alcohol provided temporary relief from visions of spiritual realms where dark entities continued their work of corruption and destruction, while also hastening the physical deterioration that would eventually free him from responsibilities that had proven too great for any individual to bear without being destroyed by the experience. The ocean spirits that had once welcomed Kuruk as their avatar began to avoid him, as his spiritual contamination made his presence disturbing to entities that existed in harmony with natural forces that his corruption violated through its very existence. The water that had always responded to his bending began to feel heavy and resistant, reflecting his disconnect from the elemental forces that were supposed to be enhanced by avatar power that had been compromised through techniques that violated fundamental principles of spiritual balance. The death that finally claimed Kuruk at 33 was both release and failure, freeing him from suffering that had become unbearable while leaving behind spiritual wounds that would influence the cosmic forces, affecting future avatar incarnations. His early death created a power vacuum that allowed dark spirits to operate with greater freedom, while the trauma embedded in the avatar cycle by his experiences would surface in subsequent incarnations as psychological vulnerabilities and spiritual blind spots that reflected the damage his soul had sustained during years of combat against forces that fought without mercy or moral restraint. The funeral that honored Kuruk's sacrifice was attended by people who knew only the public aspects of his service. their gratitude based on protection they had received from threats they never understood existed, while remaining ignorant of costs that their avatar had paid on their behalf. The ceremonies that celebrated his heroism could not acknowledge the psychological destruction and spiritual corruption that had been necessary to achieve victories that preserved human civilization at the expense of the individual who had made such preservation possible through sacrifices that could never be publicly honored without undermining faith in institutions that depended on ignorance for their continued functioning. The legacy that Kuruk left for his successor was not the enhanced spiritual abilities that previous avatars had passed down through the eternal cycle, but rather accumulated trauma and corruption that would manifest as spiritual vulnerabilities affecting Kyoshi's ability to access certain aspects of avatar power safely or effectively. The dark spirits that had been contained rather than truly defeated continued their work of cosmic corruption while planning attacks that would exploit weaknesses created by Kuruk's desperate methods of achieving temporary victories that had prevented immediate catastrophe at the cost of long-term spiritual stability. The silence that settled over the Northern Water Tribe following Kuruk's death was filled with questions that could never be answered safely, mysteries about what their avatar had faced, and why his final years had been marked by behavior that seemed to contradict everything they had been taught about the cosmic forces that were supposed to guide avatar development toward wisdom and spiritual fulfillment. The truth about spiritual warfare and its psychological costs remained hidden to protect people whose faith in cosmic justice could not survive knowledge of how their protection had been achieved and maintained. And so ended the brief life of Avatar Kuruk, whose sacrifice preserved human civilization through methods that destroyed his sanity and corrupted his spirit, while establishing precedents for future avatars who would face similar choices between personal integrity and cosmic responsibility. His death marked not victory over darkness, but temporary containment achieved through techniques that violated fundamental principles of spiritual balance, creating debts that would eventually come due in subsequent incarnations. When the accumulated costs of his desperate measures finally overwhelmed the Avatar cycle's ability to absorb and process trauma without losing essential humanity that made cosmic power beneficial rather than destructive to the world it was supposed to protect and serve. The great walls of Ba Sing Se rose from earth that had been watered with centuries of peasant blood, their massive stones carved by earthbenders who had been promised freedom upon completion of projects that somehow always required additional labor, additional sacrifice, additional years of servitude that stretched into lifetimes, spent building monuments to power they would never be permitted to share or challenge. The Earth Kingdom's capital stood as testament to the organizing principle that had governed this vast nation since its founding. The simple understanding that those who could move mountains should rule over those who could barely move themselves, and that stability was worth any price paid by people whose lives were considered expendable in service of maintaining order that benefited their betters. The transformation of Avatar Kyoshi's Dai Li from elite protectors into instruments of systematic oppression had been so gradual that no single generation could identify the moment when guardians became jailers, when servants of the people became their masters' most effective tools, for ensuring that dissent never organized into resistance that might threaten the comfortable arrangements that kept wealth flowing upward while responsibility for suffering flowed down to those least equipped to bear such burdens. The green uniforms that had once symbolized protection now inspired fear in citizens who understood that questioning authority could lead to disappearances that no inquiry would ever adequately explain or resolve. The underground chambers beneath Lake Laogai had been excavated by earthbenders, whose knowledge of what they were creating had been carefully compartmentalized to ensure that no individual worker could comprehend the full scope of the facility being constructed through their labor. The smooth walls that surrounded cells designed to hold human beings until their minds could be properly adjusted reflected light in patterns that seemed almost decorative, hiding the true purpose of spaces that had been engineered to break spirits with the same precision that architects applied to creating structures that would endure for centuries without requiring maintenance or repair. The process that the Dai Li had refined for transforming inconvenient thoughts into acceptable ones began with isolation so complete that prisoners lost track of time, seasons, and their own identities, while existing in spaces where no sound penetrated except the voices of their captors, explaining how their previous understanding of reality had been fundamentally mistaken. The earth that surrounded these chambers was more than physical barrier. It was psychological weight that pressed down upon consciousness until resistance seemed not just futile, but actually harmful to mental health, that could only be preserved through acceptance of truths that their interrogators patiently repeated until repetition made them seem natural and inevitable. Ju Di was not a person, but a position, a role filled by women whose personalities had been so thoroughly reconstructed that they could serve as perfect representatives of Ba Sing Se's commitment to maintaining peace through carefully managed ignorance of anything that might disturb the tranquility that came from refusing to acknowledge problems that acknowledgement would require citizens to address through effort and sacrifice. Each woman who bore this name had once possessed individual thoughts and desires that had been systematically replaced with programmed responses designed to deflect curiosity and redirect attention toward harmless topics that posed no threat to established power structures. The training that prepared these women for their roles involved techniques that were presented as therapeutic assistance for individuals whose mental health had been damaged by exposure to disturbing information about conflicts that did not concern them and problems that were being addressed by authorities whose expertise made civilian involvement unnecessary and potentially harmful. The process was described as healing rather than destruction, restoration rather than replacement, helping troubled minds find peace through liberation from burdens they were not equipped to carry, and concerns that were beyond their ability to influence constructively. The children who disappeared into Earth Kingdom mines were recruited through programs that their families were encouraged to view as opportunities for advancement, chances for young Earthbenders to develop valuable skills while contributing to projects that served the greater good of their communities and nation. The contracts that parents signed were filled with language that obscured the reality that their children were being sold into industrial slavery that would consume their youth and health while generating profits that would be distributed among investors who need never see the faces of those whose dotiama labor created their wealth and comfort. The working conditions in these facilities were designed to maximize productivity while minimizing the cost of maintaining workers whose lives were valued only for their ability to move Earth according to specifications that demanded precision without concern for the physical and psychological toll that such demanding labor imposed on bodies that had not yet finished growing and minds that had not yet learned to protect themselves from exploitation. The accidents that claimed young lives were recorded as unfortunate incidents rather than predictable consequences of safety policies that treated human beings as replaceable resources whose loss could be balanced against savings achieved through avoiding expensive protective measures. The foremen who supervised these operations were themselves products of systems that had taught them to view compassion as weakness and efficiency as virtue. Their advancement within organizational hierarchies dependent upon their willingness to treat other human beings as tools to be used until they broke and then replaced with fresh supplies of desperate families whose poverty made them vulnerable to arrangements that promised better futures while delivering only suffering and early death. Their casual cruelty was not sadism, but professional detachment that had been cultivated through years of practice in ignoring the human cost of achieving production quotas that determined their own survival within organizations that valued results over methods. The medical facilities that served these mining operations were staffed by healers whose training had emphasized the importance of keeping workers functional rather than healthy. Their interventions designed to return injured earthbenders to productivity as quickly as possible, without concern for long-term consequences that would only become apparent after years of accumulated damage had made continued labor impossible. The herbs and techniques that could have provided genuine healing were reserved for workers whose specialized skills made them more valuable than their easily replaceable peers, creating hierarchies of medical care that reflected economic rather than ethical considerations. The Earth Queen's court in Ba Sing Se operated according to principles that treated the suffering of common people as entertainment for aristocrats, whose boredom had become so profound that only the most extreme displays of power could provide stimulation adequate to penetrate their emotional numbness and psychological detachment from the consequences of their decisions. The human trafficking that she sponsored was organized as an elaborate game where the rules were designed to maximize humiliation and psychological torture while maintaining plausible deniability about the true nature of activities that were officially described as cultural exchange and educational opportunities. The airbenders who were captured and caged for the Earth Queen's private army were subjected to conditions that deliberately broke their spirits before attempting to reshape their loyalties towards serving interests that contradicted everything they had been taught about the proper relationship between power and responsibility. The cages that held them were designed by architects who understood that physical containment was less important than psychological domination, creating environments where hope itself became a form of suffering that could only be relieved through surrender to authorities whose demands grew more unreasonable as acceptance made resistance seem increasingly pointless. The villages that were abandoned to bandits, while Ba Sing Se's resources were devoted to maintaining the comfort of elites, represented the Earth Kingdom's approach to governance that treated citizenship as privilege to be earned, rather than right to be protected, creating conditions where rural populations were forced to choose between submitting to predatory taxation that funded urban luxury and accepting the violent chaos that followed when protection was withdrawn from communities whose productivity had declined below levels that justified continued investment in their security and welfare. The taxation systems that extracted wealth from agricultural communities were designed to operate like slow-acting poisons that gradually weakened local economies while maintaining enough productivity to justify continued extraction, until resources were completely exhausted and populations had been reduced to levels that could be sustained through subsistence farming that produced barely enough surplus to feed the bureaucrats who administered their poverty. The records that tracked these processes were maintained with bureaucratic precision that transformed human suffering into statistical abstractions that could be analyzed and optimized without emotional contamination by officials whose advancement required them to treat compassion as professional liability. The bandit groups that preyed upon these weakened communities were often organized by former Earth Kingdom soldiers whose military training had been redirected toward private enterprise when official service became unavailable or inadequately compensated for men whose skills were valued only during periods of active warfare. Their knowledge of military tactics and Earth Kingdom defensive capabilities made them particularly effective at exploiting vulnerabilities that had been created by policies that prioritized urban prosperity over rural security, creating feedback loops where government neglect generated criminal activity that was then used to justify further reduction of services to communities that could no longer afford protection. The trade routes that connected Earth Kingdom cities were maintained through arrangements that treated merchant caravans as revenue sources for officials whose cooperation was necessary for safe passage through territories where bandit activity was tolerated or actively encouraged as means of generating unofficial taxation that supplemented inadequate government salaries. The protection fees that were charged for security services were calculated to extract maximum profit while maintaining just enough safety to keep commerce flowing at levels that sustained the corrupt ecosystems that had developed around the intersection of legitimate trade and organized crime. The judicial systems that operated in Earth Kingdom territories were designed to serve the interests of those who could afford to purchase favorable verdicts, rather than seeking justice through impartial application of laws that were supposed to protect all citizens equally. The judges who presided over these proceedings were selected for their willingness to interpret legal principles in ways that served the economic interests of local elites, while maintaining enough procedural legitimacy to prevent popular uprisings that might threaten the stability upon which profitable corruption depended for its continued operation and expansion. The educational institutions that trained Earth Kingdom administrators were carefully designed to produce graduates whose moral flexibility and intellectual sophistication enabled them to implement policies that caused widespread suffering, while maintaining psychological comfort through philosophical frameworks that justified necessary evils as unfortunate requirements of effective governance that served greater goods which could only be achieved through accepting short-term costs that were inevitably borne by people whose lives mattered less than the abstract principles being served through their sacrifice. The prison systems that contained political dissidents were presented to the public as rehabilitation centers where individuals whose thinking had been distorted by exposure to dangerous ideas could receive therapeutic assistance in developing more healthy approaches to citizenship that emphasized personal responsibility over systematic criticism of institutions that were working effectively for the vast majority of law-abiding citizens who understood their proper place within social hierarchies that had been established through centuries of traditional wisdom and practical experience. The propaganda that justified these arrangements to Earth Kingdom citizens was sophisticated enough to acknowledge problems while redirecting blame toward external enemies and internal saboteurs, whose activities explained why necessary reforms had been delayed or inadequately implemented by authorities who were working tirelessly to address legitimate grievances through proper channels that required patience and trust from citizens whose impatience could only interfere with processes that were already proceeding as quickly as responsible leadership would permit, given the complex realities of governance in an imperfect world. The resistance movements that occasionally emerged to challenge these systems were systematically infiltrated and redirected by agents whose revolutionary credentials had been carefully constructed through years of participating in activities that served intelligence gathering rather than genuine opposition, their leadership positions, enabling them to guide potentially dangerous organizations toward ineffective actions that dissipated popular anger without threatening fundamental structures that generated the suffering motivating such opposition in the first place. The economic policies that maintained these arrangements were presented as necessary adaptations to competitive pressures from other nations whose success in international trade required Earth Kingdom responses that prioritized efficiency over traditional values that had become luxuries, which prosperous societies could not afford if they hoped to maintain their position in global markets, where compassion was treated as weakness and moral scruples were competitive disadvantages that successful nations had learned to abandon in a favor of practical approaches that achieved results, regardless of their human costs. And so the Earth Kingdom continued its ancient traditions of stability maintained through systematic oppression that was so thoroughly institutionalized that victims and perpetrators alike accepted their roles as natural features of social organization that had been tested through centuries of successful operation, their suffering and guilt equally necessary components of systems that delivered prosperity to those whose position enabled them to benefit from arrangements that would continue until the fundamental assumptions supporting them were challenged by forces powerful enough to overcome the massive inertia created by generations of normalized exploitation and carefully cultivated ignorance about alternatives that might serve human dignity better than the magnificent efficiency of organized cruelty dressed in the language of necessity and progress. The children who filled Fire Nation classrooms during the century of war were not born evil, but they were shaped by educational systems that had been designed with the same methodical precision that characterized all Fire Nation approaches to achieving desired outcomes through comprehensive social engineering. Their morning recitations began with pledges of loyalty to Fire Lord, a nation that were embedded so deeply in daily routine that questioning such commitments became literally unthinkable. The words flowing from young lips with the automatic certainty that came from repetition that had started before conscious memory could form resistance to ideas that were presented as natural law rather than political choice. The textbooks that guided their understanding of history had been carefully edited to remove any information that might inspire sympathy for the peoples their nation was systematically destroying, while enhancing narratives that portrayed Fire Nation aggression as reluctant response to threats posed by inferior civilizations whose backwardness and moral corruption made them dangers to global peace that could only be preserved through benevolent conquest. The maps that hung in every classroom showed Fire Nation territories in brilliant red that seemed to glow with righteous purpose, while other nations appeared in dull colors that suggested the lifelessness that characterized peoples who had not yet been blessed with Fire Nation guidance and improvement. The mathematics lessons that occupied afternoon hours were built around word problems that normalized military logistics and industrial production focused on weapons manufacture, teaching children to calculate ammunition requirements and troop deployment schedules with the same casual precision they applied to determining how many apples could be purchased with pocket money earned through completing household chores. The arithmetic of war became as familiar and comfortable as basic addition, embedding strategic thinking into young minds that would grow up viewing massive death tolls as abstract numbers rather than human tragedies requiring moral consideration or emotional response. The literature that shaped their cultural understanding consisted of epic poems celebrating Fire Nation heroes who had sacrificed everything to protect their people from savage enemies whose defeat brought civilization to lands that had been trapped in darkness before Fire Nation intervention, showed them better ways of organizing society and developing their natural resources. The stories that captivated young imaginations featured brave soldiers overcoming impossible odds to defend innocent Fire Nation families from cruel invaders whose motivations were never explained beyond simple evil that required no justification beyond the inherent goodness of those who opposed such malevolence through necessary violence. The science curricula that prepared students for adult participation in Fire Nation society emphasized practical applications of knowledge that served military and industrial purposes, teaching chemistry through lessons about metallurgy and explosive compounds, while biology classes focused on understanding human anatomy in ways that were useful for both healing friendly forces and efficiently incapacitating enemy combatants. The physics that governed combustion and flight were explored through examples drawn from weapons development and airship engineering, making the pursuit of knowledge inseparable from the advancement of capabilities that enabled their nation to project power across greater distances with more devastating effectiveness. The music that filled school assemblies and public ceremonies was composed to inspire feelings of martial pride and cultural superiority, its melodies designed to bypass rational thought and speak directly to emotional centers that responded to rhythms that matched marching cadences and harmonies that celebrated the unity that came from shared commitment to causes larger than individual concerns. The songs that children learned to sing with such enthusiasm carried lyrics that praised sacrifice for nation while demonizing enemies whose defeat was presented as moral necessity rather than political choice, their voices blending into choruses that reinforced group identity through collective expression of beliefs that individual conscience might have questioned if given opportunity for private reflection. The physical education that developed their bodies for future service included combat training that was presented as character development rather than preparation for violence, teaching children to view aggression as virtue and compassion as weakness, while building skills that would make them effective participants in campaigns of conquest that were described as missions of liberation and improvement. The competitive exercises that occupied recreation periods were designed to identify natural leaders and followers, while cultivating attitudes that treated victory as proof of moral superiority and defeat as evidence of inadequate dedication to principles that required constant vigilance and unlimited commitment. The guidance counselors who shaped career aspirations steered talented students toward military service or industrial positions that supported war efforts while discouraging interest in pursuits that might expose them to foreign ideas or encourage critical thinking about policies that were presented as beyond question by citizens whose loyalty was measured through willingness to accept official explanations without demanding evidence or logical consistency. The future that was painted for ambitious young people was one where personal success was inseparable from national triumph, where individual achievement could only be meaningful within context of collective victory over forces that threatened everything they had been taught to value. The factory complexes that surrounded Fire Nation cities were fed by streams of workers whose labor had been organized according to principles that treated human beings as components in machines designed to produce materials and weapons, that enabled their nation to maintain its growing empire through superior technology and unlimited industrial capacity. The shifts that consumed daily life were arranged to maximize productivity while minimizing opportunities for workers to form relationships or share ideas that might interfere with their dedication to tasks that were presented as patriotic service rather than industrial employment that enriched distant owners at the expense of people whose health and safety were sacrificed for efficiency. The prisoners of war who provided supplementary labor for these facilities were housed in compounds that had been designed by architects who understood that breaking human spirits was more cost-effective than maintaining expensive security measures. Their living conditions calculated to destroy hope while preserving just enough physical capability to make continued exploitation profitable for enterprises that treated captive populations as renewable resources whose replacement could be arranged through military campaigns that served dual purposes of territorial expansion and labor acquisition. The medical experiments that were conducted on captured earthbenders and waterbenders were justified through research proposals that emphasized potential benefits to Fire Nation military medicine while obscuring the reality that such studies were designed to develop more effective methods of torture and interrogation that could extract information from prisoners whose elemental abilities made conventional approaches to coercion inadequate for achieving desired results. The data that was collected through these procedures was analyzed with scientific rigor that transformed human suffering into technical knowledge that advanced capabilities for inflicting precisely calibrated damage on enemy forces. The children who grew up in communities where such facilities operated learned to accept the constant presence of suffering as a normal feature of civilized society, their moral development shaped by daily exposure to systematic cruelty that was presented as necessary component of maintaining the peace and prosperity that defined their superior way of life. The screams that echoed from industrial districts during night shifts were explained as sounds of machinery rather than evidence of human agony, while the smoke that rose from crematoriums was described as byproduct of manufacturing processes rather than evidence of disposal methods for prisoners whose usefulness had been exhausted. The families that were torn apart by military conscription learned to celebrate the honor of service rather than mourning the loss of sons and fathers, whose deployment to distant battlefields served glory that was supposed to compensate for personal sacrifice that grew heavier with each casualty. Report that arrived through official channels designed to minimize emotional impact while maintaining morale necessary for continued popular support of campaigns whose duration and cost had exceeded all original projections. The letters that arrived from active duty personnel were subjected to censorship that removed references to doubt or suffering, while emphasizing pride and determination that parents and spouses were expected to share despite accumulating wongo. Evidence that victory was proving more expensive than anticipated. The propaganda techniques that maintained civilian morale during years of grinding warfare were refined through careful study of psychological principles that could be applied to populations whose support was essential for sustaining military efforts that required unprecedented levels of resource, allocation, and human sacrifice. The newspapers that informed public opinion were filled with stories that emphasized enemy atrocities while minimizing Fire Nation casualties. Their coverage of military operations designed to create impressions of inevitable victory that would justify continued sacrifice, while discouraging questions about strategies that seemed to produce stalemate rather than decisive resolution. The children who were recruited as informants within their own families represented the ultimate triumph of state indoctrination over natural bonds, their loyalty to abstract principles of national service, superseding emotional connections to parents and siblings, whose private conversations might reveal dangerous thoughts that could undermine war efforts through spreading doubt or criticism. The rewards that were offered for reporting suspicious activities were designed to make betrayal seem like moral duty, while the consequences for failing to report known violations were severe enough to ensure that family meals became exercises in mutual surveillance rather than opportunities for intimate connection. The religious ceremonies that blessed military campaigns were carefully orchestrated to provide divine sanction for actions that might otherwise trouble consciences that had been shaped by traditional Fire Nation values emphasizing honor and protection of the innocent. Their rituals designed to transform mass killing into sacred duty, while offering spiritual comfort to participants whose psychological health required belief that their actions served purposes higher than mere political ambition or économique exploitation. The priests who conducted these services were selected for their ability to reconcile moral contradiction through theological explanations that made genocide seem like divine mandate. The entertainment that filled leisure hours was produced according to guidelines that ensured all cultural content supported war objectives, while avoiding material that might inspire sympathy for enemy populations or critical examination of policies that were presented as beyond civilian understanding or qualification to evaluate. The plays and festivals that provided recreation for urban populations were designed to reinforce themes of cultural superiority and national destiny, while celebrating virtues that made effective soldiers and compliant workers whose personal fulfillment was supposed to come from serving causes larger than individual happiness or moral questioning. The economic systems that distributed wartime prosperity were arranged to ensure that benefits flowed primarily to families whose members served in military or industrial capacities that directly supported conquest, while populations whose contributions were less essential to victory received smaller shares of wealth that was generated through exploitation of conquered territories and enslaved peoples. The rationing systems that managed scarce resources were designed to reward loyalty and punish dissent, while maintaining enough general prosperity to prevent domestic unrest that might interfere with military operations requiring total national commitment. The marriage customs that were modified to serve wartime needs encouraged unions that would produce children suitable for future military service, while discouraging relationships that might create emotional attachments, interfering with willingness to sacrifice family bonds for national objectives that required subordination of personal happiness to collective goals. The breeding programs that were disguised as patriotic duty aimed to increase population while improving genetic traits that would enhance Fire Nation capabilities for sustaining military campaigns across multiple generations of continuous warfare. The mental health services that were available to citizens suffering from psychological trauma were designed to restore functionality rather than address underlying causes of distress that often stemmed from moral conflicts between personal values and social expectations that required participation in activities that violated fundamental human decency. The treatments that were offered emphasized adjustment to existing conditions rather than examination of whether such conditions were compatible with psychological well-being that required some connection to ethical principles transcending immediate political necessities. And so an entire civilization was transformed into a machine for producing death and suffering on scales that previous generations could never have imagined possible, their success measured not by happiness or wisdom, but by their efficiency in converting human lives into territorial expansion and resource extraction that served abstract goals whose achievement required abandonment of everything that had traditionally made existence meaningful beyond mere survival and domination of others, whose destruction was presented as evidence of virtue rather than moral catastrophe that would echo through generations, whose children would inherit a world poisoned by the choices their ancestors had made, in service of glory that proved indistinguishable from organized evil, dressed in patriotic language and blessed by authorities who had learned to mistake power for righteousness. The ice that stretched endlessly around the southern water tribe settlements carried within its crystalline structure the frozen tears of mothers who had watched their daughters disappear into Fire Nation ships, their hands reaching uselessly across waters that had become barriers separating families whose bonds had been forged through generations of shared struggle against the harsh beauty of polar existence that demanded cooperation for survival, but could not protect against human cruelty that arrived from distant lands where warmth bred ambitions that cold climates had never nurtured. The aurora that danced across winter skies bore witness to grief that had accumulated like snowfall, each flake a memory of someone who would never return to igloos that grew emptier with each raid, while the survivors learned to hide their pain beneath expressions of stoic acceptance. That masked desperation, growing deeper with every passing season. The water-bending masters, who had once guided southern water tribe communities through the subtle applications of their element, were systematically targeted for capture through intelligence networks that had been developed by Fire Nation strategists who understood that cultural destruction was more effective than simple conquest. their removal creating voids in traditional knowledge that could not be filled by untrained practitioners, whose attempts to continue ancient practices without proper instruction often failed in ways that endangered the very people they were trying to help. The healing techniques that had sustained tribal communities through countless winters of scarcity and hardship were lost along with the women who had carried such wisdom in memories that died with them. In Fire Nation prisons where their captors viewed their abilities as military assets rather than sacred trust passed down through maternal lineages that stretched back to the founding of civilization itself. The children who grew up in this diminished world learned waterbending through desperate experimentation that produced crude approximations of techniques their grandmothers had mastered with graceful precision, their movements awkward and inefficient, because they lacked the foundational understanding that could only be transmitted through patient instruction from teachers who had themselves learned from masters whose knowledge had been refined through centuries of accumulated wisdom now lost forever. The ice that formed under their inexperienced guidance was brittle and unreliable, breaking at crucial moments when strength was needed most, while their attempts at healing sometimes caused more harm than benefit because they did not understand the delicate balance required to channel life force through human tissue without disrupting vital systems that maintained health and function. Katara's desperate attempts to reconstruct her cultural heritage through stolen scrolls and fragmentary memories represented the broader tragedy of an entire people trying to preserve traditions that could not survive without the living context that gave techniques their meaning and purpose. Beyond mere mechanical repetition of movements that had been disconnected from the spiritual understanding that made waterbending an expression of harmony with natural forces rather than simple manipulation of physical matter. Her frustration with her own limitations reflected the collective anguish of a generation that had inherited responsibility for maintaining culture they had never been properly taught, their efforts hampered by gaps in knowledge that left them fumbling toward understanding that previous generations had taken for granted. The marriage customs that had once celebrated the joining of families within communities large enough to maintain complex social networks were reduced to desperate attempts to preserve genetic diversity within populations that had been decimated by systematic removal of breeding-age women, whose capture served Fire Nation objectives while ensuring that recovery would be impossible, even if military pressure was eventually lifted. The ceremonies that had once involved elaborate celebrations extending across multiple settlements were simplified to brief exchanges witnessed by handfuls of survivors whose own relationships had been similarly truncated by circumstances that made long-term planning seem pointless when future raids could eliminate participants before unions could produce children to carry traditions forward. The hunting practices that had sustained Southern Water Tribe communities for millennia were disrupted by military activities that drove away marine life while creating dangerous conditions that made traditional expeditions impossible or suicidal, forcing populations that had always supplemented their diet with fresh protein to rely increasingly on preserved foods that provided adequate nutrition but could not supply the variety necessary for maintaining health through long polar nights when bodies required extra resources to generate warmth and resist depression that came from extended darkness and social isolation. The knowledge that had guided successful hunting was passed down through masculine lineages that were equally vulnerable to disruption when young men were killed, defending their communities, or forced into hiding to avoid conscription into Fire Nation labor forces. The alcohol that began to flow more freely through Southern Water Tribe communities as despair deepened was provided by traders whose business models depended on populations whose traditional coping mechanisms had been destroyed by circumstances beyond their control, their profits generated through exploitation of psychological vulnerabilities that had been created by systematic cultural destruction. that made intoxication seem preferable to clear perception of hopeless circumstances. The fermented beverages that had once been reserved for ceremonial occasions became daily escapes from reality that grew more unbearable. As social structures collapsed and individual identity became disconnected from cultural frameworks that had previously provided meaning and purpose for existence, that suddenly seemed pointless and endless. The storytelling traditions that had preserved tribal history and wisdom through oral transmission across countless generations began to fragment as communities became too small to maintain the complex narrative cycles that required multiple voices to complete properly. Their stories shortened and simplified until rich cultural heritage was reduced to bare fragments that conveyed plot without the deeper meanings that had made such tales valuable for guidance and inspiration. The elders who had been responsible for maintaining these traditions found their audiences shrinking as younger people struggled with more immediate concerns of survival, while the old stories seemed to belong to a world that no longer existed and offered little relevant wisdom for navigating circumstances that their ancestors had never faced. The spiritual practices that had connected southern water tribe peoples to the moon and ocean spirits were compromised by trauma that made meditation and prayer feel like luxuries that communities under constant threat could not afford. Their rituals abbreviated or abandoned entirely as psychological resources were consumed by hypervigilance that made the peaceful contemplation necessary for spiritual communion impossible to achieve or maintain. The sacred sites where such practices had traditionally been conducted were often located in exposed positions that made them vulnerable to attack, forcing worshippers to choose between maintaining religious observances and avoiding detection by enemies whose raids were timed to catch communities during moments of spiritual vulnerability. The Northern Water Tribe's rigid patriarchy that had once been balanced by Southern traditions, emphasizing gender equality, created additional burdens for women whose cultural heritage was being systematically destroyed, while their sisters in the North maintained social structures that treated female waterbenders as too precious to risk in combat, but too dangerous to allow full development of their capabilities. The arranged marriages that served Northern political objectives often ignored personal compatibility in favor of strategic alliances that strengthened tribal leadership, while creating domestic situations where individual happiness was sacrificed for collective security that proved inadequate against threats that conventional political thinking had not anticipated or prepared to address. The healing knowledge that Northern women were permitted to develop remained limited to applications that served domestic purposes rather than the comprehensive understanding of waterbending's medical potential that could have saved lives and reduced suffering if cultural restrictions had not prevented its full exploration and implementation. The women who possessed natural talent for combat applications of their element were forced to choose between accepting limitations that wasted their abilities or challenging social expectations that could result in exile from communities that offered the only protection available against fire, nation, aggression, and environmental dangers that made solitary survival impossible in polar regions. The arranged marriages that bound Northern Water Tribe women to political necessities rather than personal affection created households where intimacy was replaced by duty, while childbearing became obligation rather than joy, their reproductive capacity treated as resource to be managed by authorities who viewed population growth as military necessity rather than natural expression of love and family formation. The children who resulted from such unions often grew up in environments where emotional connection between parents was absent or artificial, their development shaped by models of relationship that emphasized compliance over communication and resignation over the partnership that healthy marriages required for producing psychologically stable offspring. The isolation that characterized Water Tribe existence during the war years was not simply geographical, but psychological, as communities that had once maintained extensive networks of trade and cultural exchange were forced to become self-sufficient in ways that their traditional economy had never required, creating shortages and hardships that went beyond material deprivation to encompass the social impoverishment that came from losing contact with relatives and allies who had provided emotional support and practical assistance during difficult periods. The messages that might have maintained connections across distances became impossible to send safely, while travel that had once been routine became potentially fatal exposure to military forces that treated all water tribe movement as inherently suspicious. The traditional games and competitions that had once provided entertainment and social bonding during long winter nights were abandoned as communities became too small to organize proper tournaments, while the physical spaces necessary for such activities were converted to defensive purposes that served survival needs but eliminated opportunities for the recreational activities that had made harsh living conditions bearable through shared enjoyment and friendly rivalry. The skills that had been developed through such competitions were redirected toward military applications that served immediate defensive needs, but could not replace the cultural functions that games had served in maintaining community, morale, and individual identity. The crafts traditions that had produced the clothing, tools, and decorative objects that expressed water tribe cultural identity were simplified to focus on items necessary for basic survival, while the knowledge required for creating more elaborate pieces was lost along with the artisans who had possessed such skills and the social structures that had supported their development through apprenticeship systems that required stable communities and predictable resource flows. The aesthetic sensibilities that had made water tribe material culture distinctive and beautiful were subordinated to purely functional considerations that served immediate needs while abandoning the creative expression that had made harsh existence meaningful and psychologically sustainable. The medical knowledge that had enabled water tribe communities to maintain health despite limited resources and challenging environmental conditions was disrupted by the loss of healers whose expertise had been developed through years of training that required peaceful conditions for the observation and practice necessary to master techniques that could mean the difference between life and death during medical emergencies. The herbs and natural remedies that had been gathered during traditional seasonal migrations were no longer available when movement became restricted by military dangers, forcing communities to rely on inadequate substitutes, while preventable illnesses claimed lives that could have been saved under normal circumstances. The leadership structures that had guided water tribe governance through consensus-building processes that respected individual autonomy while maintaining collective decision-making capabilities were simplified to focus on immediate military necessities that required quick responses, rather than the careful deliberation that had traditionally characterized tribal politics, creating precedents for authoritarian control that served wartime needs but undermined democratic traditions that had sustained these communities through previous challenges that had been less existentially threatening, but equally demanding of unity and cooperation. The children who came of age during these years of constant crisis learned to view violence as normal and peace as impossible dream, rather than achievable goal. Their psychological development shaped by experiences that made trust seem naive and cooperation seem dangerous when survival required hypervigilance and readiness to fight or flee at any moment. The games they played mimicked combat rather than traditional activities, while their dreams were filled with scenarios of attack and escape rather than the adventures and explorations that had once captured young imaginations and inspired hopes for futures that seemed worth the effort required to achieve them. And so the water tribes endured through adaptations that preserved biological existence while sacrificing much of what had made their culture valuable and their communities sources of meaning and identity, rather than simply collections of individuals united by shared desperation and common enemies, whose defeat might restore some semblance of normal life, but could never fully repair the damage done to social structures and cultural traditions that had required centuries to develop and could be destroyed in decades through systematic application of violence that understood exactly what it was trying to eliminate and how to accomplish such destruction efficiently. The blood that stained Avatar Kyoshi's hands after her confrontation with Qin the Conqueror never fully washed away, despite decades of meditation and service that followed her decision to solve political crisis through methods that violated every principle of conflict resolution that had been passed down through Avatar traditions, emphasizing diplomacy and understanding over the finality of death that could not be undone once delivered in service of justice that seemed clear only in retrospect. The earth that had split beneath Qin's feet as Kyoshi Island separated from the mainland carried with it the weight of precedent that would influence every subsequent Avatar's understanding of what methods were acceptable when peaceful solutions proved inadequate for addressing threats that endangered innocent lives and fundamental principles of cosmic balance. The creation of the Dai Li had seemed like enlightened compromise at the time. Kyoshi's recognition that earthbending could serve law enforcement purposes without requiring the kind of lethal force that had characterized her solution to Qin's tyranny, but the secret police that emerged from her well-intentioned reforms would eventually become instruments of oppression that perverted her vision of justice into tools for maintaining political control through methods that she would have found abhorrent if she could have foreseen how her innovations would be corrupted by successors whose understanding of power lacked the moral constraints that had originally motivated her desire to create alternatives to assassination and warfare. The uniforms that marked Dai Li agents as servants of order would eventually inspire fear rather than confidence among citizens whose protection had been the original justification for establishing forces that evolved into threats to the very people they had been created to serve. Avatar Roku's friendship with Fire Lord Sozin had been forged during childhood games that seemed innocent enough when played by boys whose futures held responsibilities that no child could comprehend or prepare for adequately. But the emotional bonds that developed during those carefree years would eventually become chains that prevented decisive action, when such action might have prevented the century of war that followed Roku's death and Sozin's betrayal of everything their relationship had once represented. The volcano that claimed Roku's life provided him with honorable death while performing heroic rescue of civilians whose immediate danger seemed more pressing than the long-term threat posed by a friend whose ambitions had grown beyond the boundaries that friendship should have been able to impose through moral influence and shared memories of better times when power had not yet corrupted either of them. The mercy that Roku showed during his confrontation with Sozin in the throne room was presented as weakness by his predecessor's spirit when consulted by Aang decades later. The older Avatar's regret over his failure to kill his childhood friend when such action might have prevented massive suffering, serving as warning that personal attachments could become obstacles to cosmic duty that required prioritizing abstract justice over individual relationships that meant nothing when weighed against the welfare of entire civilizations. The restraint that had seemed virtuous during the moment of decision was reframed as moral failure when its consequences became apparent through the systematic genocide and conquest that Sozin's survival had made possible. The energy bending that Aang employed against Fire Lord Ozai was presented as merciful alternative to execution, but the reality of permanently severing someone's connection to their elemental abilities was arguably more cruel than simple death, creating a form of spiritual amputation that left the victim conscious and aware of what had been taken from them, while forcing them to continue existing in a diminished state that might be worse than the peaceful oblivion that killing would have provided. The technique that seemed to satisfy both justice and compassion was actually a form of torture that prolonged suffering while satisfying the Avatar's need to avoid taking life directly, creating compromise that served his psychological needs more than any genuine moral imperative. The psychological warfare that energy bending represented was made more disturbing by its irreversible nature, the permanent destruction of fundamental aspects of identity that left victims unable to participate in the cultural activities that had defined their existence, while forcing them to live with constant awareness of abilities they could never access again. The Fire Lord who had once commanded flames that could reduce cities to ash was reduced to ordinary mortality without even the consolation of martyrdom that execution might have provided, his continued existence serving as reminder of defeat that was more humiliating than heroic death would have been. The precedent that Aang established through his use of energy bending created expectations that future avatars would employ similar techniques when facing comparable threats. But the Lion Turtle's warning about the spiritual purity required for safe application of such power suggested that most practitioners would risk corruption through attempting to wield forces that demanded moral certainty that few individuals could maintain under pressure of cosmic responsibility. The technique that had saved Aang from compromising his principles became burden for successors who might lack his spiritual foundation, while facing situations where energy bending seemed like obvious solution to problems that conventional Avatar powers could not address adequately. Avatar Korra's decision to keep the spirit portals open following her victory over Vaatu represented fundamental change in the relationship between human and spirit worlds that had been maintained through careful separation for thousands of years. Her choice motivated by idealistic vision of harmony that ignored practical considerations about how two realms with different natural laws and moral frameworks could coexist without creating conflicts that would endanger both. The chaos that followed her decision demonstrated that good intentions were inadequate foundation for policies that affected the fundamental structure of reality and the safety of populations who had not been consulted about changes that would reshape their entire existence. The spiritual vines that overran Republic City following harmonic convergence created displacement and property destruction that affected thousands of families whose homes and businesses were consumed by vegetation that served spiritual purposes but ignored human needs for shelter and economic stability, their suffering dismissed as acceptable cost of achieving greater harmony that existed more in theory than practical reality. The people who lost everything to accommodate spirit world expansion had no voice in decisions that prioritized abstract principles over immediate human welfare, their displacement treated as unfortunate necessity rather than predictable consequence of policies that had not adequately considered the impact on populations who would bear the costs of cosmic change. The airbending abilities that emerged in random individuals following harmonic convergence might have seemed like restoration of Aang's lost culture, but the untrained practitioners who suddenly found themselves manipulating air currents without understanding proper techniques or philosophical foundations posed dangers to themselves and others while lacking the spiritual discipline that had made traditional air nomads peaceful rather than destructive. The power that was distributed without accompanying wisdom created situations where elemental abilities became weapons in the hands of people whose moral development had not prepared them for the responsibility that came with capability to affect the physical world through direct manipulation of natural forces. Zahir's transformation from philosophical extremist to dangerous terrorist was enabled by airbending abilities that he used to implement political theories that might have remained harmless academic speculation if he had not acquired power that made his destructive vision of freedom achievable through assassination and chaos, that served ideology more than any genuine desire to improve conditions for people whose welfare was supposedly justifying his violent methods. The Earth Queen's death and the resulting collapse of governmental authority created suffering that affected millions of people whose lives were destabilized by revolutionary changes that had been implemented without consideration for alternative approaches that might have achieved reform, without destroying the social structures that provided basic services and security. The isolation that characterized Avatar existence was both cause and consequence of the cosmic responsibilities that required decisions affecting entire civilizations, while lacking the democratic legitimacy that would have made such authority morally defensible in societies that valued self-determination over benevolent dictatorship, no matter how well-intentioned such dictatorship might be. The Avatar's role as bridge between worlds was supposed to provide wisdom and perspective that transcended normal human limitations. But the loneliness that came from carrying such responsibility often produced psychological distortions that interfered with judgment and emotional stability necessary for making sound decisions under pressure. The cycle that connected each avatar to their predecessors through spiritual communion was designed to provide guidance and accumulated wisdom, but the trauma and moral compromise that characterized many avatar experiences meant that such connection often transmitted damage along with knowledge, creating psychological vulnerabilities that manifested as recurring patterns of failure and internal conflict that reflected the unresolved issues of previous incarnations rather than the specific challenges facing current situations. The voices of past avatars could provide encouragement for decisive action, but they could also pressure their current incarnation towards solutions that had worked in different circumstances while being inappropriate for present conditions that required fresh approaches rather than repetition of historical precedents. The avatar state that was supposed to represent the ultimate expression of cosmic power was actually a form of temporary possession that subsumed individual consciousness within the collective experience of all previous incarnations, creating psychological fusion that could overwhelm personal identity and moral judgment, while channeling power that exceeded any single individual's capacity to control or direct safely. The enhancement that the avatar state provided came at the cost of personal autonomy and individual responsibility, transforming the avatar into vessel for cosmic forces that operated according to principles that might not align with human values or contemporary ethical understanding. The training that prepared avatars for their cosmic role was necessarily incomplete because the full scope of their responsibilities could not be understood until they were actually faced with decisions that affected the fundamental balance of existence, creating situations where learning occurred through trial and error that could have catastrophic consequences, when mistakes involved forces capable of reshaping reality itself. The childhood that was supposed to provide emotional foundation for handling such pressure was often truncated by circumstances that forced premature acceptance of duties that no individual could bear without psychological damage that would influence every subsequent decision throughout their incarnation. The relationships that avatars formed with friends and advisors were inevitably complicated by power imbalances that made genuine equality impossible when one person possessed abilities that could reshape continents while others remained dependent on normal human capabilities for affecting change in the world around them. The love that bound avatar couples together had to accommodate the reality that cosmic duty could require abandonment of personal happiness at any moment, while the children who inherited Avatar heritage carried expectations and burdens that normal family structures could not adequately prepare them to handle throughout lives that would be defined by their connection to cosmic forces beyond normal human comprehension. The legacy that each Avatar left for their successor was a mixture of achievements and failures that reflected the impossible nature of their role as individual human consciousness, tasked with maintaining balance in systems that operated on scales beyond any single perspective's ability to comprehend or manage effectively. The solutions that worked during one incarnation often created problems for the next, while the moral compromises that seemed necessary during crisis periods established precedents that would influence future decisions in ways that might be inappropriate for different circumstances, requiring fresh approaches to familiar challenges. The weight of cosmic responsibility gradually consumed whatever personal identity had existed before the Avatar role was accepted, transforming individuals with unique perspectives and relationships into vessels for forces that served universal principles rather than human values or individual desires that had to be sacrificed for greater goods that remained abstract, even when their necessity was undeniable. The boy who had once played with lemurs became the man who had to choose between personal integrity and global survival, while the girl who had dreamed of waterbending mastery became the woman who had to remake the fundamental structure of reality according to theories that might prove catastrophically wrong. And so the Avatar cycle continued its eternal revolution through incarnations that carried both blessing and curse of ultimate power combined with ultimate responsibility, each lifetime devoted to cleaning up problems created by previous decisions while generating new crises for future incarnations to address through methods that would inevitably require moral compromises that served cosmic balance at the expense of individual souls who were gradually consumed by forces they were supposed to control, but which ultimately controlled them through the terrible mathematics of necessity that made heroes into victims of their own success in preventing disasters that would have been worse than the damage done to their essential humanity through the methods required to achieve such prevention. The steel and glass towers that rose from Republic City's harbor district cast shadows that fell most heavily upon neighborhoods where families crowded into tenements that had been hastily constructed to house the industrial workers, whose labor powered the gleaming metropolis that Aang had envisioned as symbol of harmony between nations, but which had evolved into monument to the ancient truth that prosperity for some invariably required exploitation of others, whose suffering remained hidden behind architectural facades, designed to showcase progress while concealing the human cost of achieving such rapid urban development. The smoke that belched from factory chimneys carried with it particles of ground bone and dreams deferred, settling like ash upon communities where children learned to recognize the taste of industrial poison in air they breathed and water they drank, while their parents worked shifts long enough to prevent organized resistance to conditions that would have sparked revolution in societies less skilled at managing discontent through carefully distributed scraps of hope. The criminal organizations that flourished in Republic City's shadows had been inadvertently nurtured by policies that created vast populations of desperate people whose legitimate opportunities for advancement were blocked by systematic discrimination that treated non-bending as inherited disability worthy of sympathy but not accommodation, while bending abilities became credentials for employment that paid wages adequate for dignity and security, that remained beyond reach for families whose genetic lottery had not provided them with elemental manipulation skills that increasingly determined social position in supposedly egalitarian society. The triple threat triad and similar enterprises offered alternative paths to prosperity that required different moral compromises than those demanded by conventional employment, but at least they provided clear reward structures for individuals willing to risk imprisonment or death rather than accepting permanent relegation to economic roles that served others' comfort without providing adequate compensation for their own needs. The metal-bending police force that Toff had established with noble intentions of creating law enforcement that could address bender crime through superior technique and training had evolved into paramilitary organization whose members were recruited primarily from earthbending families whose cultural background emphasized strength and dominance over the cooperation and communication skills necessary for community policing that served all citizens rather than protecting the interests of those whose property and status made them worthy of attention from authorities. The metal cables that could restrain criminal benders with efficiency that conventional weapons could not match were also employed against non-violent protesters whose only crime was demanding representation in governmental processes that affected their daily lives, while excluding their voices from decision-making that determined resource allocation and policy implementation. The pro-bending arena that provided entertainment for Republic City's affluent populations was surrounded by underground fighting circuits, where desperate parents encouraged children with elemental abilities to participate in competitions that offered prize money substantial enough to make the risk of serious injury seem worthwhile when weighed against certainty of continued poverty and malnutrition that would damage young bodies just as surely as organized violence, but without providing any hope of escape from circumstances that made such brutal choices seem rational. The crowds that gathered to bet on these spectacles were drawn from all social classes. Their shared enthusiasm for watching children hurt each other, creating temporary solidarity that transcended economic boundaries, while reinforcing attitudes that treated human suffering as entertainment worthy of monetary investment. The factory accidents that claimed dozens of workers each month were documented with bureaucratic precision that transformed individual tragedies into statistical abstractions that could be analyzed for cost-benefit calculations that balanced compensation payments against safety improvements, whose expense might reduce profit margins below levels that investors considered acceptable returns on capital, that had been risked in ventures that created wealth through methods that externalized human costs onto populations whose political influence was insufficient to demand better protection. The investigations that followed these incidents were conducted by inspectors whose salaries were ultimately paid by the same industrial interests they were supposed to regulate, creating conflicts of interest that were acknowledged through policies that emphasized compromise and accommodation, rather than enforcement of standards that might interfere with economic growth. The housing that was available to non-bender families in Republic City's outer districts had been constructed according to building codes that prioritized maximum occupancy over habitability, their walls thin enough to provide minimal privacy, while their ventilation systems were inadequate for removing industrial fumes that seeped through foundations built too close to manufacturing facilities whose toxic emissions were legally acceptable as long as they remained below thresholds established through studies funded by corporations whose profits depended on maintaining standards that prioritized economic considerations over public health concerns that could not be quantified in terms that fit accounting spreadsheets. The rent that consumed most working-class family income left little money for nutrition or medical care that might have compensated for environmental hazards that made childhood development a struggle against poisoning that began in utero and continued throughout lives spent in communities where clean air and water were luxuries that geography and economics made inaccessible. The mixed families that had formed during Republic City's early years, through marriages between people from different nations, found their relationships tested by social pressures that demanded cultural assimilation into dominant patterns that favored Fire Nation and Earth Kingdom traditions, while treating Water Tribe and Air Nomad customs as exotic curiosities, rather than legitimate alternatives that deserved equal respect and institutional accommodation. The children who resulted from such unions often experienced identity confusion that was compounded by educational systems that taught simplified versions of history that ignored the complex negotiations and compromises that had made their existence possible, while their parents struggled to maintain cultural practices in urban environments that provided neither space nor community support for traditions that required extended family networks and seasonal rhythms that industrial scheduling could not accommodate. The corruption that permeated Republic City's governmental institutions was so thoroughly normalized that honest officials were treated as naive idealists whose unrealistic standards interfered with practical administration that required flexibility in applying rules that had been written by people who did not understand the complex realities of managing diverse populations with competing interests and limited resources. The bribes that lubricated decision-making processes were disguised as consulting fees and charitable contributions that allowed all parties to maintain plausible deniability about transactions that served mutual benefit while violating both spirit and letter of laws designed to prevent exactly such arrangements from determining policy outcomes that affected thousands of people who had no voice in discussions that shaped their daily existence. The newspapers that informed public opinion about civic affairs were owned by investors whose business interests were directly affected by governmental policies they covered. Their editorial positions shaped by advertising revenue from corporations that expected favorable coverage in exchange for financial support that made publication profitable enough to continue operations that served propaganda functions, more than journalistic responsibilities to inform citizens about issues they needed to understand to participate meaningfully in democratic processes. The stories that received prominent coverage were selected according to criteria that emphasized entertainment value over civic importance, while investigative reporting that might expose systematic problems was discouraged through budget constraints that made such work financially impractical for organizations dependent on revenue streams controlled by subjects they were supposed to monitor independently. The schools that educated Republic City's children were segregated not through official policy, but through residential patterns that concentrated wealthy families in districts served by institutions that received adequate funding, while working-class neighborhoods struggled with overcrowded classrooms and inadequate resources that made quality education impossible for students whose potential was wasted through systematic neglect disguised as budgetary necessity. The curriculum that was taught in these different environments varied dramatically in scope and sophistication, creating educational inequality that perpetuated class distinctions across generations, while maintaining appearances of equal opportunity that existed only on paper and in political speeches designed to deflect criticism from activists, whose demands for reform were dismissed as unrealistic given fiscal constraints that somehow never applied to projects that served more affluent constituencies. The medical facilities that served non-Bender populations were staffed by healers whose training had been adequate for treating common ailments, but who lacked the specialized knowledge necessary for addressing health problems caused by industrial exposure and environmental contamination that created disease patterns unlike anything encountered in traditional medical practice. The equipment that was available in these clinics was often outdated and insufficient for diagnostic procedures that might have identified occupational illnesses in early stages when treatment could have been effective. while the cost of more sophisticated care remained beyond reach for families whose employment barely provided survival income and certainly could not accommodate medical expenses that insurance programs specifically excluded through clauses that defined work-related conditions as pre-existing problems not covered by policies designed to minimize payouts rather than maximize patient care. The cultural institutions that were supposed to preserve and celebrate the diverse heritage that Republic City claimed as its defining characteristic were funded through private donations that came primarily from wealthy patrons whose aesthetic preferences and political views influenced programming in ways that marginalized traditions and perspectives that might challenge dominant narratives about progress and harmony. The museums that displayed artifacts from all 4 nations were arranged according to evolutionary frameworks that presented Fire Nation and Earth Kingdom achievements as pinnacles of development, while treating Water Tribe and Air Nomad cultures as primitive stages that had been superseded by more advanced civilizations whose superiority was demonstrated through their current dominance rather than any objective evaluation of their contributions to human knowledge and artistic expression. The transportation systems that connected different districts of Republic City were designed to serve commercial and administrative needs rather than residential populations, their routes and schedules determined by the movement patterns of goods and government officials, rather than working families whose daily commutes between home and employment consumed hours that might otherwise have been available for rest or family interaction that could have provided emotional support necessary for maintaining psychological health under stressful conditions. The fares that were charged for public transit consumed significant portions of household budgets, while the service that was provided remained inadequate for meeting demand during peak hours when overcrowding created dangerous conditions that resulted in injuries and deaths that were treated as acceptable costs of maintaining affordable transportation, rather than evidence of underinvestment in infrastructure that served public welfare. The fire safety systems that protected Republic City's residential buildings were maintained according to standards that varied dramatically based on property values and rental rates, with expensive apartments receiving regular inspections and prompt repairs, while tenements in working-class neighborhoods were allowed to deteriorate until catastrophic failures claimed lives that investigations would later determine it could have been prevented through maintenance procedures that building owners had avoided to reduce operational costs. The firefighting services that responded to emergencies were equipped and trained primarily for protecting commercial and governmental facilities whose destruction would affect economic activity, while residential fires in poor neighborhoods often received delayed response that arrived too late to prevent tragedies that could have been avoided through different priority systems that valued human life over property protection. The waste disposal systems that served Republic City's growing population were designed to transport garbage and sewage away from affluent districts while concentrating such materials in areas where land values were too low to generate political opposition from residents whose complaints could be safely ignored by authorities who responded primarily to constituencies capable of funding electoral campaigns. The environmental health hazards that resulted from these arrangements created disease patterns that disproportionately affected children and elderly people whose immune systems were least capable of resisting contamination that was officially within acceptable limits established through studies that measured economic impact more carefully than biological effects on human populations, whose suffering was quantified through statistical methods that obscured individual tragedy behind aggregate data that could be manipulated to support predetermined conclusions. The recreational facilities that were available to Republic City's residents reflected the same class divisions that characterized every other aspect of urban life. with parks and entertainment venues in wealthy neighborhoods receiving maintenance and programming that created attractive environments for leisure activities, while working-class districts were provided with minimal green space that often served as dumping grounds for industrial waste that made such areas unsuitable for family gatherings or children's play. The sports leagues and cultural programs that were supposed to provide healthy outlets for young people's energy and creativity were funded through fee structures that excluded families who could not afford equipment and registration, costs that represented significant portions of household budgets already strained by basic survival expenses. And so, Republic City evolved into perfect microcosm of how good intentions could be corrupted by economic forces and political pressures that transformed idealistic visions of harmony into systematic arrangements that served the interests of those who possessed power, while maintaining enough superficial equality to prevent revolution. Their success measured not by the welfare of all citizens, but by the continued stability of institutions that preserved existing hierarchies while adapting to changing circumstances through reforms that addressed symptoms rather than causes of inequality, that remained fundamental features of urban organization designed to extract maximum value from human resources while minimizing the cost of maintaining populations whose labor created prosperity they would never be permitted to share equitably. The monastery where Zahir spent his years of imprisonment had been designed by Earth Kingdom architects who understood that true confinement required more than physical barriers, its walls constructed to create psychological pressure that would gradually erode the revolutionary fervor that had made him dangerous enough to warrant such elaborate security measures, while providing enough comfort to prevent the martyrdom that death might have created among followers whose dedication to his cause had survived his capture and incarceration. The meditation practices that occupied his daily routine were monitored by guards who had been trained to recognize the difference between spiritual discipline and the preparation for violence that could emerge from philosophical contemplation when combined with the kind of absolute certainty that made compromise impossible and negotiation pointless for individuals whose worldview admitted no possibility that their understanding of justice might be incomplete or misguided. The books that filled Zahir's cell had been carefully selected to provide intellectual stimulation without access to practical knowledge that might enhance his capabilities for causing destruction when opportunity for escape eventually presented itself, their contents focusing on abstract philosophy and historical analysis rather than technical information about engineering or chemistry that could be applied to creating weapons from materials that prison security had deemed harmless. The Air Nomad texts that formed the foundation of his ideological framework were ancient works whose original authors had never intended their wisdom about detachment and liberation to be interpreted as justification for assassination and shaos, their gentle teachings about freedom from earthly attachments twisted into rationalization for eliminating anyone whose existence seemed to conflict with theoretical perfection that could only be achieved through methods that violated every principle the original philosophers had actually advocated. The airbending abilities that manifested during harmonic convergence transformed Zahir from imprisoned theorist into active terrorist, whose capacity for destruction was amplified by years of studying air nomad philosophy without the spiritual discipline and moral foundation that had made such knowledge safe in the hands of practitioners whose understanding of power was balanced by commitment to preserving life rather than eliminating obstacles to abstract ideals. The element that had traditionally been associated with peace and harmony became tool for assassination and destabilization when wielded by someone whose interpretation of ancient wisdom emphasized liberation through destruction rather than the gentle guidance toward enlightenment that air nomad. Masters had actually taught their students throughout centuries of peaceful contemplation. The escape from his White Lotus prison was accomplished through techniques that demonstrated how quickly philosophical knowledge could be converted to practical applications when moral constraints were abandoned in favor of efficiency that prioritized results over methods. His newfound abilities allowing him to overcome security measures that had been designed to contain earthbenders and firebenders, but could not anticipate the unique challenges posed by someone who could manipulate air currents to achieve flight and create vacuums that made conventional defensive strategies inadequate for preventing breakout that had been planned through years of patient observation and theoretical preparation. The reunion with Pli, Gazan, and Minghua was marked by recognition that their shared imprisonment had been transformed by harmonic convergence into opportunity for implementing plans that had seemed impossible when they lacked the supernatural abilities necessary to overcome governmental and military opposition that conventional terrorism could never hope to defeat through normal methods. The group dynamics that had sustained them through years of separation were immediately re-established as they discovered that their individual skills complemented each other in ways that made their combined capabilities far more dangerous than simple addition of their separate talents would have suggested through mathematical calculation. Poli's combustion bending had been refined through years of forced practice in White Lotus facilities where her captors had attempted to study her abilities while keeping her contained, their research inadvertently providing her with deeper understanding of her own capabilities, while teaching her how to overcome defensive measures that had been developed specifically to counter the explosive attacks that made her the most feared member of their revolutionary cell. The precision that she had developed through targeting exercises designed to measure her abilities had been transformed into surgical capability for eliminating specific individuals while minimizing collateral damage that might turn public opinion against their cause, though such considerations were ultimately secondary to achieving objectives that justified any level of destruction necessary for success. Gazan's lava bending represented geological power that could reshape landscapes while creating tactical advantages that conventional military forces could not counter through established defensive strategies. His ability to transform solid earth into molten rock, providing both offensive capabilities and escape routes that made traditional concepts of fortification obsolete when facing opponents who could literally melt the foundations of any structure that might be used to contain or resist their activities. The underground networks that he could create through controlled application of his abilities offered possibilities for movement and concealment that made tracking and pursuit nearly impossible for authorities whose understanding of earthbending had not prepared them for applications that violated normal assumptions about how elemental manipulation could be employed strategically. Minghua's water bending without arms had forced her to develop techniques that exceeded the capabilities of conventional practitioners. Her disability transformed into advantage through innovations that made her more dangerous than opponents who possessed normal anatomy, but lacked the creative adaptations that had been necessary for her survival in environments where physical limitations would have meant death for anyone less determined to overcome circumstances that seemed insurmountable through conventional approaches. The water that served as her limbs could be weaponized in ways that traditional waterbending masters had never explored, creating offensive possibilities that combined reach and flexibility with cutting force that made her effectively invulnerable in any environment that contained adequate moisture for her techniques. The philosophy that bound these individuals together was more than shared hatred of governmental authority. It was comprehensive worldview that treated all forms of organized power as inherently corrupt and therefore deserving of destruction, regardless of the human cost that such destruction might impose on populations who had not chosen to participate in revolutionary struggle that claimed to serve their interests while ignoring their actual preferences and needs. The freedom that they promised was abstract concept that bore little resemblance to the practical liberty that required stable institutions and social cooperation to maintain conditions where individual autonomy could flourish without degenerating into chaos that made meaningful choice impossible. The Earth Queen's assassination was planned with military precision that took advantage of Ba Sing Se's security weaknesses while exploiting the political tensions that made her death seem like liberation to populations who had suffered under her authoritarian rule, without understanding that alternative forms of governance required preparation and institutional development that could not be improvised in aftermath of sudden regime change. The method that Zahir employed was chosen specifically to demonstrate airbending's lethal potential, while sending message to other world leaders about the consequences they might face if they continued to exercise power that the Red Lotus considered illegitimate, regardless of popular support or democratic mandate. The suffocation that claimed the Earth Queen's life was accomplished through techniques that perverted air nomad knowledge about breath and life force into instruments of execution that violated every principle that had guided airbending development throughout its peaceful history, the element that had always been associated with preservation of life, transformed into tool for terminating existence through methods that were both technically efficient and symbolically devastating for anyone who understood the philosophical implications of using air itself as weapon against consciousness that depended on respiratory function for survival. The irony that liberation was being achieved through elimination of the very breath that made freedom possible was apparently lost on Revolutionary, whose commitment to abstract principles had blinded him to practical contradictions embedded in his methods. The chaos that followed the Earth Queen's death demonstrated how quickly complex societies could collapse when central authority was suddenly eliminated without adequate preparation for transition to alternative forms of governance that could maintain essential services and prevent the social disintegration that made ordinary citizens more vulnerable than they had been under even authoritarian rule. The bandits and warlords who filled the power vacuum created by royal authority's elimination were less accountable to popular welfare than the monarchy had been. Their predatory behavior, made possible by exactly the kind of governmental collapse that the Red Lotus had sought to achieve through their campaign of systematic destruction. The refugees who fled Ba Sing Se and other Earth Kingdom cities were forced to abandon homes and possessions that represented generations of accumulated security while seeking shelter in camps that lacked adequate resources for sustaining populations whose displacement was direct result of revolutionary activities that had claimed to serve their liberation from oppressive systems. The suffering that these families experienced was dismissed as acceptable cost of achieving freedom that remained theoretical abstraction for people whose immediate needs included food, shelter, and protection from criminals who exploited social breakdown to prey upon vulnerable populations without fear of legal consequences. The Earth Kingdom's fragmentation into competing territories, controlled by individuals whose authority was based on violence rather than consent, created conditions where human rights abuses flourished without even the minimal restraints that had existed under centralized monarchy. The warlords who carved up former royal territories, treating civilian populations as resources to be exploited rather than citizens whose welfare should guide governmental policy. The liberation that had been promised resulted in multiple forms of tyranny that were more brutal and arbitrary than the single oppressive system they had replaced through methods that prioritized destruction over construction of better alternatives. Korra's pursuit of the Red Lotus was complicated by her own psychological trauma and physical limitations that made confrontation with opponents whose abilities were specifically designed to counter Avatar powers more dangerous than any challenge she had previously faced. Their coordination and tactical planning, representing organized resistance that could not be overcome through raw power or individual heroism, but required strategic thinking and collaborative effort that her injuries and emotional state made difficult to sustain effectively. The battles that followed tested not only her bending abilities, but her understanding of when violence was justified and when alternative approaches might serve justice more effectively than direct confrontation. The poison that nearly killed Korra was designed to force her into Avatar state, where her enhanced vulnerability could be exploited to eliminate the entire Avatar cycle permanently. The Red Lotus, demonstrating understanding of Avatar physiology and spiritual mechanics that exceeded even her own knowledge about the cosmic forces she was supposed to control and direct toward maintaining global balance. The mercury that coursed through her system represented more than physical toxin. It was assault on the fundamental nature of Avatar existence that threatened to sever connections between incarnations and end the eternal cycle of reincarnation that had sustained cosmic order for thousands of years. The recovery that followed Korra's survival was complicated by neurological damage that affected her ability to access Avatar abilities, while creating psychological associations between spiritual power and physical vulnerability that made full utilization of her cosmic role dangerous to her individual survival and mental health. The poison's effects extended beyond immediate medical crisis to encompass long-term disabilities that would influence every subsequent Avatar incarnation through trauma embedded in the spiritual cycle that connected all manifestations of the Avatar spirit across time and cultural boundaries. The execution of the Red Lotus members who were captured represented victory that felt hollow because their ideas had already inspired other revolutionary movements whose activities would continue to threaten stability and governmental pace, authority throughout regions where their anti-institutional philosophy had found fertile ground among populations whose suffering made radical solutions seem preferable to gradual reform that might take generations to achieve meaningful improvement in living conditions. The deaths of individual terrorists could not eliminate the ideological framework that had motivated their actions and would continue to influence future activists whose desperation might drive them to similar conclusions about the necessity of destroying existing systems regardless of consequences. And so Zahir's vision of perfect freedom was achieved through methods that created exactly the kind of suffering and oppression that his philosophy had claimed to oppose. The chaos he unleashed, serving to demonstrate that liberation without construction was merely destruction disguised as idealism, while the power vacuum created by eliminating established authority was inevitably filled by forces less accountable and more brutal than those that revolutionary action had supposedly overthrown in service of principles that sounded noble in theoretical discussion but proved catastrophic when implemented through violence that recognized no limits except the complete elimination of any structure that might constrain individual will, regardless of whether such constraint served collective welfare or individual safety, that could only exist within frameworks of mutual obligation and social cooperation, that his absolute individualism made impossible to maintain or develop. The military parade that announced Kuvira's transformation from Republic City's protector into the Earth Empire's supreme leader moved through streets lined with citizens whose cheers were carefully orchestrated by security forces that had learned to distinguish between genuine, enthusiasm, and the kind of cautious applause that people offered when silence might be interpreted as disloyalty to authorities whose tolerance for dissent had evaporated along with their commitment to democratic principles that had proven inadequate for addressing the chaos left behind by the Earth Queen's assassination and the Avatar's temporary absence from active duty. The banners that decorated government buildings proclaimed unity and strength, while concealing the systematic campaigns of cultural purification that were already beginning in territories where populations had been classified as insufficiently loyal to the new order that promised stability through methods that made previous authoritarian regimes seem restrained by comparison. The re-education camps that dotted the Earth Empire's expanding territory were presented to international observers as vocational training facilities where citizens could develop skills necessary for productive participation in modernized economy, but the curriculum that was actually taught focused on political indoctrination, designed to eliminate independent thinking and replace personal identity with collective loyalty to state ideology that treated individual consciousness as obstacle to social harmony that could only be achieved through complete submission to central authority. The instructors who administered these programs had been selected for their ability to recognize and eliminate resistance to thought reform that was accomplished through techniques that left physical appearance unchanged, while fundamentally altering psychological responses to stimuli that had previously triggered critical evaluation or emotional attachment to values incompatible with total state control. The scientific research that was conducted within these facilities was justified through official explanations about developing better methods for treating mental illness and antisocial behavior, but the actual experiments were designed to perfect psychological manipulation techniques that could be applied to entire populations through mass media and educational systems that would make future resistance impossible by eliminating the cognitive capabilities necessary for questioning authority or imagining alternative forms of social organization. The data that was collected through systematic torture was analyzed by researchers whose professional advancement required them to treat human suffering as raw material for developing more efficient methods of control that would make traditional forms of coercion unnecessary because compliance would become automatic response programmed into consciousness itself. The children who were separated from parents, deemed ideologically unreliable, were placed in institutional settings where their development was carefully monitored and shaped through techniques that combined advanced understanding of child psychology with ruthless determination to produce adults whose loyalty to the state would be absolute and unquestioning regardless of what actions such loyalty might require them to perform or witness without experiencing emotional distress that could interfere with their effectiveness as tools of governmental policy. The games that occupied their recreation periods were designed to reinforce hierarchical thinking and competitive attitudes that made cooperation with peers less important than advancement within systems that rewarded betrayal of friends and family, when such betrayal served institutional interests. The loyalty tests that were administered throughout Earth Empire territory were presented as routine administrative procedures, but they were actually sophisticated psychological evaluations designed to identify individuals whose commitment to state ideology was insufficient to guarantee compliance with orders that might conflict with previously held moral beliefs, or emotional attachments that could interfere with implementation of policies requiring citizens to participate in activities that served collective good, regardless of personal consequences for themselves or people they cared about. The questions that appeared innocuous were actually designed to reveal thought patterns that indicated potential for resistance or the kind of independent judgment that could become dangerous if allowed to develop without proper intervention. The industrial facilities that powered the Earth Empire's military expansion were staffed by workers whose productivity was maintained through surveillance systems that monitored not only output but also conversations and facial expressions that might indicate dissatisfaction, or the kind of critical thinking that could spread through workplace communities to create organized opposition to policies that prioritized production quotas over worker safety or compensation adequate for maintaining health and family stability. The accidents that claimed lives on regular basis were investigated by committees whose recommendations consistently emphasized the need for workers to accept greater personal responsibility for following safety procedures rather than addressing systemic problems that made such accidents inevitable. Consequences of operational policies designed to maximize efficiency regardless of human costs. The villages that were designated for elimination were evacuated through procedures that were officially described as voluntary relocation to areas with better economic opportunities, but the force that was employed to ensure compliance with these directives demonstrated the true nature of programs that were designed to concentrate populations in locations where they could be more effectively controlled while freeing up territory for industrial development or military installations that served strategic purposes, more important than maintaining communities that had existed for centuries but were deemed obstacles to progress that required their removal, regardless of cultural or emotional attachments that such displacement would sever permanently. The ethnic minorities that were targeted for special attention by Earth Empire authorities were classified as security risks based on cultural characteristics and historical associations that made their loyalty to central government questionable, according to theories about racial and cultural determinism that justified discriminatory treatment through scientific-sounding language that disguised prejudice as rational policy based on objective analysis of behavioral patterns and genetic predispositions that supposedly made certain populations inherently unsuitable for full citizenship in modernized society that required homogeneous cultural identity for optimal functioning. The marriage licenses that were issued by Earth Empire bureaucrats were contingent upon genetic testing and ideological evaluation that ensured reproduction would serve state objectives rather than personal desires or romantic preferences that might produce children whose characteristics were unsuitable for roles they would be expected to fill within planned economy that required predictable supplies of workers with specific capabilities and psychological profiles that could be developed more efficiently when breeding was directed according to scientific principles rather than left to random emotional attachments that served individual happiness over collective needs. The medical care that was provided to Earth Empire citizens was designed to maintain productivity rather than promote genuine health, with treatments that focused on returning workers to functional status as quickly as possible, while avoiding expensive interventions that might extend life expectancy beyond economically useful years when continued existence would consume resources without generating adequate returns on investment in healthcare infrastructure. The physicians who administered these systems were trained to view patients as components in larger economic machinery rather than individuals whose welfare should guide medical decisions. Their professional success, measured by efficiency metrics that prioritized cost reduction over patient outcomes that could not be quantified through accounting methods. The educational curriculum that shaped young minds throughout the Earth Empire was carefully designed to produce graduates who possessed technical skills necessary for supporting industrial and military objectives while lacking the critical thinking abilities or historical knowledge that might enable them to evaluate government policies or imagine alternative forms of social organization that could serve human welfare more effectively than systems that treated citizens as resources to be managed rather than individuals whose rights and dignity should constrain governmental authority, regardless of efficiency gains that might be achieved through treating people as expendable assets. The propaganda that filled newspapers and radio broadcasts was sophisticated enough to acknowledge problems while consistently attributing them to sabotage by foreign agents or internal enemies, whose activities explained why necessary reforms had been delayed or inadequately implemented, creating narrative frameworks that deflected criticism away from systemic issues towards scapegoat populations that could be blamed for difficulties that were actually caused by policies designed to benefit leadership at the expense of general population whose suffering was dismissed as acceptable. Cost of achieving greatness that would eventually benefit everyone. Once obstacles created by treasonous elements had been eliminated through appropriate measures. The cultural institutions that were permitted to operate within Earth Empire territory were required to present artistic and intellectual content that reinforced state ideology while avoiding themes or perspectives that might inspire critical examination of official policies or romantic attachment to values incompatible with total dedication to collective goals that required subordination of individual desires to central planning that could achieve optimal outcomes only when personal preferences were not permitted to interfere with rational allocation of resources and assignment of roles based on objective evaluation of capabilities and social needs rather than subjective wishes or emotional attachments. The resistance movements that emerged to oppose Earth Empire policies were systematically infiltrated by agents whose apparent opposition to government authority was actually sophisticated intelligence operation designed to identify and eliminate potential leaders before they could organize effective opposition, while the information gathered through such operations enabled authorities to anticipate and counter resistance activities before they could achieve sufficient momentum to threaten stability of systems that had been carefully designed to prevent exactly the kind of organized dissent that might challenge central authority through methods that could not be contained through conventional law enforcement or military response. The collaboration that flourished throughout Earth Empire territory was not simply a result of fear or coercion, but reflected genuine enthusiasm among citizens whose material conditions had improved under authoritarian rule and who believed that sacrifices required for maintaining order were justified by benefits they received through systems that rewarded loyalty and punished resistance, according to principles that seemed fair to people whose previous experience with democracy had been limited to chaos and economic uncertainty that made stable dictatorship seem preferable to freedom, that came with risks and responsibilities they were not prepared to handle effectively. The international recognition that the Earth Empire received from governments whose own stability was threatened by refugee flows and economic disruption created diplomatic legitimacy that made military intervention seem unjustified to populations whose primary concerns were maintaining their own prosperity and security rather than defending abstract principles of human rights and democratic governance that meant less than practical considerations about trade relationships and strategic alliances that served national interests more directly than moral posturing that could compromise economic opportunities and political stability. The spirit weapon that represented the culmination of Earth Empire technological development was presented as defensive measure necessary for protecting territorial integrity against foreign aggression, but its destructive capabilities exceeded anything that could be justified as proportionate response to realistic threats, while its existence created precedent for other nations to develop similar weapons in arms race that would make future conflicts more devastating than any war in recorded Ben. History, while serving no strategic purpose beyond demonstrating power that was ultimately directed more toward intimidating domestic populations than deterring international enemies who possessed their own weapons of mass destruction. And so Kuvira's vision of order was achieved through methods that required systematic elimination of human dignity and individual autonomy in service of collective efficiency that benefited only those whose position within hierarchical systems enabled them to extract value from others by labor and suffering while maintaining psychological comfort through ideological frameworks that justified necessary evils as temporary measures required for achieving greater good that would somehow emerge from accumulation of smaller compromises that gradually transformed entire civilization into machinery for converting human consciousness into mechanical compliance with directives issued by authorities whose power was justified only by their ability to maintain systems that served their own interests while destroying everything that made existence meaningful for populations whose welfare was supposedly being served through their systematic dehumanization. The children who were born into the ashes of Kuvira's Earth Empire carried within their genetic code the accumulated trauma of parents who had survived concentration camps and re-education facilities. Their cellular memory encoded with stress responses that would manifest as hypervigilance and emotional numbing that made healthy relationships impossible to form or maintain throughout lives, spent anticipating violence that might never come but felt constantly imminent due to psychological damage that could not be healed through conventional therapy or the passage of time that was supposed to soften wounds, but instead allowed them to fester into generational patterns of dysfunction and despair. The nurseries where these infants spent their earliest months were filled with cries that carried frequencies of ancient suffering, their vocal patterns already shaped by hormonal imbalances that reflected their mother's exposure to chronic terror during pregnancy that had altered fetal development in ways that would influence personality, formation, and cognitive capabilities throughout lifetimes spent struggling against neurochemical disadvantages that no amount of love or opportunity could completely overcome. The avatar who would emerge to address the crisis that followed Kuvira's defeat was born into a world where the very concept of balance had been corrupted by decades of extremism that had swung between anarchic chaos and totalitarian and control, without ever achieving the stability that true harmony required, each violent overcorrection creating conditions that made subsequent disasters inevitable through social dynamics that rewarded radical solutions over moderate approaches that might have addressed underlying problems without generating new forms of suffering for populations whose resilience had been exhausted through repeated exposure to political upheavals that promised improvement while delivering only different varieties of exploitation and oppression. The spiritual realm itself had been contaminated by the accumulated anguish of millions of souls whose deaths had been so traumatic that their energy could not dissipate naturally into cosmic recycling systems that depended on peaceful transitions between incarnations. The technological innovations that had been developed during the Earth Empire's industrial militarization remained available to whoever could claim control over manufacturing facilities and research archives that contained blueprints for weapons that could destroy entire cities, while the knowledge necessary for constructing such devices spread through black market networks that served criminal organizations and terrorist movements whose objectives varied but whose methods increasingly relied on mass destruction that made conventional military responses inadequate for containing threats that could emerge anywhere without warning. The spirit weapon technology that Kuvira had pioneered was reverse-engineered by engineers whose ethical constraints had been eroded through working in environments where efficiency was valued over moral considerations, their innovations making it possible for small groups to wield power that had previously required nation-state resources and governmental authority. The refugees who had fled Earth Empire persecution during Kuvira's reign found themselves unwelcome in neighboring territories where local populations viewed them as economic competitors and potential security threats, whose presence strained resources while their different cultural practices created social tensions that politicians exploited through campaigns that blamed immigrants for problems that had actually been caused by policies designed to benefit wealthy elites at the expense of working families whose standard of living had declined. Regardless of refugee status or immigration patterns, the camps that housed displaced persons became breeding grounds for extremist ideologies that offered simple explanations for complex problems while providing psychological comfort through identifying scapegoat populations that could be blamed for conditions that were actually caused by systematic exploitation that enriched the same authorities who promoted xenophobic hatred as distraction from economic inequality. The spirits who had been driven from their traditional territories by industrial development and military activities carried rage that had accumulated through decades of environmental destruction and cultural desecration that violated agreements that had been negotiated centuries earlier, when human populations were smaller and less technologically capable of causing permanent damage to ecosystems that supported supernatural entities whose existence depended on maintaining harmony between physical and spiritual realms. The climate changes that resulted from massive resource extraction and industrial pollution created conditions where malevolent spirits could manifest more easily, while beneficial entities withdrew from regions where their presence was no longer compatible with levels of toxicity that made spiritual communion impossible for all but the most corrupted forms of supernatural consciousness. The economic systems that had been established to support Earth, Empire, military production were converted to civilian manufacturing that maintained the same exploitative labor practices while producing consumer goods that were designed to fail after predetermined periods to ensure continued demand for replacements that generated profits through planned obsolescence that treated environmental degradation and resource depletion as acceptable externalities of business models that prioritized short-term gains over long-term sustainability. The workers who had been enslaved in military factories found themselves nominally free but economically dependent on employers who offered wages barely adequate for survival while maintaining surveillance and control systems that had been developed during wartime but proved equally effective for preventing labor organization and maintaining productivity through psychological pressure rather than physical coercion. The educational institutions that reopened after Kuvira's defeat were staffed by teachers whose training had been completed under authoritarian curricula that emphasized obedience and conformity over critical thinking and creative problem-solving. Their instructional methods shaped by pedagogical approaches that treated students as receptacles for information rather than active participants in learning processes that could develop intellectual independence and ethical reasoning, capabilities necessary for participating effectively in democratic governance that required citizens capable of evaluating competing claims and making informed decisions about complex policy issues. The textbooks that were hastily revised to remove Earth Empire propaganda were replaced with materials that reflected different political biases while maintaining the same passive approach to knowledge transmission that discouraged questioning of authority and exploration of alternative perspectives. The medical systems that had been organized to serve military objectives were restructured to address civilian needs, but retained hierarchical structures and resource allocation methods that prioritized treating conditions that affected productivity over interventions that might improve quality of life for populations whose economic value was limited by age, disability, or other factors that reduced their contribution to gross domestic product calculations that guided healthcare policy decisions through cost-benefit analyses that measured human welfare in purely financial terms. The physicians who had participated in Earth Empire medical experiments were often the only practitioners available with expertise necessary for treating complex conditions, creating ethical dilemmas about whether their knowledge should be utilized, despite its origins in systematic human rights violations. The artistic communities that emerged from underground resistance movements brought creative energy and cultural innovation that offered hope for social renewal. But their work was often corrupted by trauma and anger that made aesthetic expression into vehicle for perpetuating cycles of hatred and revenge that prevented healing and reconciliation necessary for building sustainable peace between populations that had been divided by years of systematic persecution and mutual atrocities committed in service of competing ideological frameworks. The museums and cultural centers that were established to preserve memory of Earth Empire crimes became sites of pilgrimage for people whose grief had been transformed into political movements that sought justice through methods that resembled the authoritarian approaches they claimed to oppose. The international organizations that had failed to prevent or adequately respond to Earth Empire aggression were restructured through reforms that were designed to address institutional weaknesses that had enabled Kuvira's expansion. But the new systems maintained the same fundamental problems of competing national interests and inadequate enforcement mechanisms that made collective action impossible when immediate intervention might have prevented humanitarian disasters that became unstoppable once they gained momentum through political and military dynamics that rewarded decisive action over careful deliberation and diplomatic compromise that served long-term stability over short-term advantage. The Avatar training protocols that were developed to prepare future incarnations for challenges that exceeded anything previous avatars had faced were based on psychological and spiritual techniques that had been proven effective under normal circumstances but were inadequate for maintaining sanity and moral clarity when dealing with threats that required methods that violated fundamental principles of Avatar philosophy, while the alternative was allowing mass suffering that could only be prevented through accepting moral compromise that would damage the Avatar's spiritual integrity and connection to cosmic forces that provided guidance and power necessary for fulfilling cosmic responsibilities that grew more complex with each generation. The young people who came of age during the Reconstruction period had been shaped by exposure to violence and instability that made them skeptical of democratic institutions and attracted to authoritarian solutions that promised security and order through methods they had learned to associate with effectiveness rather than moral legitimacy. Their political preferences, influenced by childhood experiences that had taught them to value survival over freedom and to view compassion as weakness, that endangered collective security that could only be maintained through strength and vigilance that required sacrificing individual rights for group protection that benefited some members more than others, through hierarchical arrangements that concentrated power among those whose loyalty to established order could be guaranteed through rewards that made collaboration more profitable than resistance. The Avatar who inherited this damaged world would face choices that no previous incarnation had confronted, their cosmic responsibilities complicated by technological capabilities that could destroy entire civilizations, while social problems required solutions that transcended traditional categories of national sovereignty and individual rights, that had become obsolete in contexts where local decisions could affect global survival, and personal choices could have planetary consequences that made individual autonomy incompatible with collective welfare, that demanded coordination and control mechanisms that violated democratic principles while remaining necessary for preventing catastrophic outcomes that would make such principles irrelevant, because there would be no civilization left to benefit from philosophical ideals that meant nothing to populations struggling for basic survival. The spirit world itself had been fundamentally altered by the accumulated trauma and corruption that had seeped through dimensional boundaries during decades of systematic violence and environmental destruction, creating conditions where malevolent entities could manifest more easily, while beneficial spirits withdrew from interaction with physical reality that had become too toxic for their continued presence and involvement in human affairs that seemed destined to create additional suffering regardless of supernatural intervention that had historically provided guidance and support during crisis periods that tested human capacity for ethical behavior under extreme pressure that revealed character through choices that could not be undone. Once their consequences became apparent through results that affected innocent people who had no voice in decisions that determined their fate. The cycles that had been established through centuries of avatar intervention had been broken by technological developments that made traditional approaches to maintaining balance inadequate for addressing challenges that required new methods and different philosophical frameworks that had not yet been developed through accumulated wisdom and experience that took generations to acquire and refine through trial and error that could not be accelerated without accepting risks that might prove catastrophic if mistakes were made during experimental phases of learning that previous avatars had been able to conduct safely because their errors affected smaller populations and less powerful technologies than those available to modern practitioners, whose failures could have consequences that extended far beyond immediate temporal and geographical boundaries that had previously contained the damage that inevitably resulted from imperfect judgment exercised under impossible circumstances that demanded perfection from individuals whose human limitations made such perfection achievable only through spiritual transcendence that few consciousnesses could sustain without losing essential humanity that connected them to populations they were supposed to serve. And so we reached the end of our journey through the shadows of the Avatar world, having witnessed the endless cycle of suffering that no amount of bending mastery can ever truly break. The four nations may know periods of peace, but darkness always returns in new forms, wearing new faces, speaking new justifications for ancient cruelties. The Avatar may be the bridge between worlds, but bridges are built over chasms of human suffering that no single person can ever hope to fill. Each incarnation does their best, saves who they can, but the wheel of history turns on, grinding new victims beneath its weight. Perhaps this is the most profound truth of all, that in a world of such beauty and wonder, such darkness must also exist. Light defines shadow, just as shadow gives meaning to light. The Avatar cannot eliminate evil, only contain it for a time, knowing that somewhere, in some form, it will always return. Rest now, knowing that even in darkness, some souls fight against the shadows. Even if they cannot win forever, they ensure that hope, however fragile, never dies completely.